Okay, we've muted everybody at the moment. We're going to begin now. And of course, we've got Jay Smith here. This is the first of 5 sessions on the new discoveries. And these things are happening as we speak. Incredible things are being discovered on the historical critique of Islam. Very powerful stuff. I'm sure we're going to have more entering as we come in. I will need to mute you all. But when you type in, if you have a question, just type it in chat. Precede the question with the word question, all caps if you will, and then ask your question. It'll make it easy for Jay to spot the questions and then to go through and answer them. We wish we could have an open discussion, but even this first presentation is going to be too many people for that and probably way too many in the other ones. So with that, Jay, let me turn it over to you and you can ask Johnson to begin us. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Good. Now, listen, I was just looking at some of the people there. Don McCurry, good to have you on board. For those of you who don't know, I studied under Don McCurry, so I'm one of his students. It's nice to have a professor come and sit in on a student's lecture. So that was years ago, Don. I don't know if you remember that back in California in our Fuller days. Okay, let's go ahead and let's open up. And I'm going to ask Johnson, if they're in Kerala, in India, if you could go ahead and open us up in prayer.
Okay, shall we pray together? Father, we are grateful to you for giving us this wonderful time together. Thank you for being with us. And thank you for our dear brothers, and especially Jay and his team, working very hard to reach Muslims for the Lord. We just want to thank you for the new findings which we could be able to get through on past weeks. And this day, we just commit our dear brother in your hand as we are going to get to know new things that we can defend our gospel to the people, those who are perishing. We just want to thank you for all the people, those who are joined with this group today. Also, I just want to pray for those who are going to speak. Be with them, give them grace from above. We just want to thank you for being with us. We just pray and commit this session in your hand. In Jesus' precious name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Johnson, for doing that. Johnson is the one, our liaison in India, who has been being in charge of getting a lot of the Indian evangelists on board. And we've been doing a whole series of sessions since March with his group, about 120, maybe even more than that now. But what I want to do in these next 5 weeks is to try to bring around the whole question concerning the historical critique of Islam. And this is an area that has been close to my heart for the last 25 years. I started this back in, my goodness, 1994. I was in London and I was studying under Dr. Gerald Hawting. They're at the School of Oriental and African Studies. And he started bringing in lots of material, all of it historical. He himself is a historian, and he said that he spent 20 years of his life trying to critique the Bible, trying to use redacted criticism, source criticism, these different types of what we call literary criticisms, basically under the umbrella of historical criticism to confront the Bible. And he said after 20 years, he finally just gave up. However, he knew all the languages, and so he said, why don't he just take his energies and apply it to the Quran and to the Islamic traditions? And he says, since then, it's just been enormous amount of new material that's come down the pike. And you'll see why once we get into this lecture. And so that was really where my antenna went up back in 1994 from Dr. Gerald Hawting. And I realized at that time that I needed to take this down to Speaker's Corner. And I started funneling his material, what I was getting in class, down at Speaker's Corner in London at Hyde Park. And it was absolutely exciting, energizing. The Muslims did not know what to do with this material. They had never heard this kind of material. And they did not like it. They were very angered by it. I did get beat up a few times. And I remembered even Gerald Hawting, when he heard what I was doing, he took me aside into his office and he says, do not ever use this in a place like Speaker's Corner or in any public setting. This is not to be brought down to the public sphere. And I kind of looked at him incredulously, and I said, if you're teaching us this material, we have all the right and the obligation to actually get it out and actually field test it for you. I'm field testing it. I'm getting it peer reviewed almost immediately, I was telling him. But he was fearful that if the Muslims got a hold of this material, that the repercussions would come back onto his shoulders. And I can understand that. That is one of the unique things about Islamic criticism. Anytime you do criticize Islam, you're going to get a reaction. And that's why polemics against Islam is very rare and not very popular. Certainly, it's not very popular amongst Muslims. Many of you have just seen what happened to my colleague, Hatun Tash, just last Sunday, where she had to be protected by the police and had to be escorted from the corner. This just happened 4 days ago. And as they were escorting her, the Muslims were trying to get to her. They were throwing water on her. And then they were yelling, kill her, kill her, kill her, 6 times. You can see it on the video that's up on Fander Films. This just happened on Sunday in London at Hyde Park at Speaker's Corner. This is what happens when you criticize Islam, when you criticize specifically the Quran, and when you criticize Muhammad, which she did both on that day, and which she has been doing for years, because that's what we always do. Now, criticizing Muhammad by putting up those Charlie Hebdo covers is one thing, but going to the historical critique is much more damaging. It is more academic, and therefore it's not always understood on the popular level. I will say that. So what I'm going to be doing in these next 5 lectures is looking at 5 areas of criticism. The first one we're going to start with is the QIBLA. And this is Dan Gibson's research. It has been around. Dan Gibson is the one who, well, he's the best known for it. We're going to be looking at his material. We're going to be looking at certainly his research and the results of his research. We're going to be looking at some brand new material that's just come out. This is one of the great things about historical criticism. There is new material coming out every year, every month. In fact, some of it even every day. And that's particularly going to come to the fore when we get to the 5th lecture, which is on the quest. But let's start with the QIBLA. The QIBLA will be looking at his material, and then we'll be moving over into the coins. The coins are brand new. This is new research that's just been coming out since January of this year. It's not new in that the coins are not new. They have always been around for 1400 years, because we're going to look at the 7th century coins. And we're going to see what they tell us, because they're telling us a completely different story than what the later 9th and 10th century traditions are telling us. And then we're going to move into this very exciting material that's been really all over the internet because of Hatun Tash, almost entirely because of her, concerning the Qira'at and the Ahruf. She is the one that found the 26 different Qira'at Qur'ans, 26 different Qur'ans that were not the same, all Arabic. None of these were translations, and she found them in different countries there in the Middle East. These are Arabic Qur'ans, and she and I took them down to Speaker's Corner 4 years ago and held them up, and you know the rest of the story, what happened after that, especially what happened 3 months ago. And so we're going to unpack that and look at the newest research that's coming out on the Qira'at and the Ahruf, the different derivations of the Arabic Qur'ans that are in the world today. 30 official ones. There could be as many as 700 of these different Qur'ans. We'll move then into what I consider is my favorite subject, and that is the Quranic manuscripts. You notice these all start with Q. Well, okay, one starts with C. I don't know how to spell, but it sounds like a Q. And so we're going to go into the Qur'ans, the Quranic manuscripts. We're going to look at these manuscripts, and we're going to ask the question whether or not they are the same. We're going to be looking at a lot of Dr. Dan Brubaker's material. We're looking at his newest research, the 4,000 different changes that he has found in the earliest manuscripts. And then we're going to pinpoint looking at specific manuscripts that Muslims claim are 7th century, and we're going to debunk every one of those claims. And then we're going to end with the quest. I call it the quest because this is the quest for Islam in the 7th century. Where is this religion, Islam, in the 7th century? Can we find it? We're going to be looking at questions concerning Muhammad. Is he in the 7th century? Can we find him? Is he the same Muhammad, if he is there, as in the 9th and 10th century traditions? And this is material that I've been going through, if you've been looking on Fander Film, with Mel from Sneaker's Corner. We'll also move into looking at some of the claims concerning whether or not he wrote letters or whether or not there was different types of communication with him. We're going to debunk those. We're going to look at the rock inscriptions. We're also going to be looking at the claims for Mecca in the 7th century. Mecca, this is the one that a lot of Muslims need to find because, and without Mecca, you pretty well don't have any Islam. You need to have Mecca. You need to have the Kaaba. You need to have the center of history. And we're going to debunk every one of those claims on Mecca. That's exciting. In fact, that could be a lecture in and of itself. And then we're going to be looking at also the name Islam and the name Muslim. And also we're going to see what we know about the Quran in the 7th century, dovetailing for what we had done the week earlier. So those are the 5 main lectures. They're going to be one each Thursday at this time. We are recording it. They will be going up on the internet, so you can see them, but you will not have the chance to question and have this live debate back and forth. And as Steve said, as we go through this material today, do have your questions ready and start writing them out now in the chat button, which is at the bottom of the screen. You'll be chatting amongst each other, that's fine. But if you have a question, just write question in capital letters, and then I will know where to zero in when we get to the Q&A period towards the end. So let's get right into it, and let's go and let's start with the whole question of the QIBLA. And to do that, I want to go and share a screen. I'm going to be doing that from here. We're going to look at Gibson's latest discoveries and the debate between Gibson and King. You probably don't know who that I'm talking about. Hold on, and we'll get to that. So let's start with this first question. Now, you might say, hold on a minute. Why are we talking about Dan Gibson, and why are we talking about the QIBLA, and why are we talking about Petra and, of course, Jordan, because Petra is in Jordan, when all this newest material that's been coming up that we've been putting up in the last 2-3 weeks has to do with Iraq? Or is there not a conflict between Iraq and Jordan? And no, there isn't. These are not conflicting. They are actually complementary and sequential. Let me just explain that. So before anybody starts getting upset with why am I talking about Jordan still when we've already moved over to the east, over to Iraq, in most of our most recent videos, Iraq concerns politics and the Quran, and also the theological debate. So there's completely different categories that we're talking about when we talk about Iraq. Whereas Petra and Jordan, that we're going to talk about today, concerns really only the Qiblas and the direction of prayer of the mosques. Therefore, Iraq both precedes Petra and returns following Petra. So when we get to Iraq, we'll see, and we'll be looking at from the years 577 to 636. That will be the last talk that we're going to talk about, and that will be when I look at whether Muhammad existed, whether Islam existed, whether there were people called Muslims, whether there was a religion called Islam, whether there was a city called Mecca, or whether there was a book called the Quran. That will be in the last lecture. It will bring it, tying in all of these other 4 lectures together in the last final lectures. And those are the years 577 to 636. Petra are from the years 626 to 727. So we're talking about a totally different time period, and we're not talking about Islam. You'll see that. Petra has nothing to do with Islam other than the fact that it predates and gives us and moves us and is a nascent Quran, or moves us into what later became Islam. Iraq then becomes important again from 736 and onwards, and that's why we're then going to return to it when we look at the Qur'ans in the Qira'ats, because all of that takes place up in Iraq. And that's why it's fascinating that everything that I'm going to be talking about in these 5 lectures has to do with much further north, and not with the Hijaz, not with that central area of Arabia where you find both Mecca and Medina, where supposedly all of Islam began, where supposedly Adam and Eve were sent to, where supposedly Abraham lived, and where supposedly this Kaaba has existed since the time of the very beginning. Can you see why this critique, this historical critique, is not based on the 9th and 10th century material, but on the 7th century and earlier? And then as we get into the Quran, and as we get into how Islam was finally initiated and began, we're then moved back to the 8th, 9th, and 10th century and look and see what history tells us about that. So let's begin with the very first category, and let's begin with the Qiblas. Now, to do that, we need to ask the question, what is the basis for Islamic history? Where do Muslims get their ideas concerning their own history, concerning their own beginning, concerning how their religion began. Now, they claim that 1400 years ago, Muhammad did live. He existed at that time, born in 570 and died in 632. And he was the last and the greatest of a whole line of prophets. He was the last of them. So the Quran was his revelation, sent down only to him, and is the final and greatest revelation. Islam, therefore, is the final religion based on Muhammad's life and sayings. That's the Sunnah, and on the Quran's teaching. Conclusion. Therefore, everything that Muslims are dependent on really is dependent on one book and one man. I've said this many times, the book and the man, the book and the man. I think I've also, my team in London actually copyrighted that phrase under my name. So I do own that phrase. So we should investigate both the Quran and Muhammad and see if indeed the Muslims are correct. And let's first study the look at Muhammad. Let's look at the emergence of Islam, and let's go back to the 7th century. And let's first ask what Muslims tell us about their man Muhammad. And what they say is very simply, and you can see it there on the screen, that he was born in 570, received revelations in the Hira cave in 610, and then received these revelations there in Mecca, the city of Mecca, for the next 12 years. During that time in 621, he was suddenly was woken up, and in the middle of the night, Jibril tells him to get on the back of a winged horse called the Burak, flies up to Jerusalem and ascends the 7 heavens, and there he meets with God, Allah, and gets the 50 prayers, which he then dwindles down or brings him down to 5 prayers, running back and forth between Moses in the 5th heaven and God in the 7th heaven. That happens in 621. In 622, then he moves from Mecca up to Medina, and known as the Hijrah. Then from 622 to 632, the last 10 years, we have what we call the Medinan revelations. He then conquered Mecca in 630, died in 632. At that time, the Quran had not yet been written down in a book form. Parts had been written down, and much of it had been memorized. Abu Bakr comes to power, and he rules for 2 years. He dies in 634. Then Umar takes over. He rules for 10 years. He is killed. Uthman then takes over. He rules for 12 years up until 656. He is killed. Ali then takes over, and he is the adopted son of Muhammad, and he only rules for 5 years before he is killed up until 661. So from that period of 624 to 661 is the known as the Rashidun period, the period of the rightly guided caliphs. This is the golden age of Islam. And this is the Islam that all the Muslims on the right, the radical Muslims, want to get back to. So that's the classical account. That's what you've all been told. That's what we've all been told. That's the only narrative that's out there. That's the only everything that I ever got taught. I remember when I took my courses from you, Don, this is what you taught back there in the 1980s. And I'm still sure that most people are still teaching this view. Why? Because where else are you going to go if this is the only thing they tell you? Well, let's take a look at a timeline and let's look and see what we're talking about. Look and see when all this material occurred. Remember, I started with 570 and I talked about his death in 632. You can go up until the time that Ali was then killed in 661 if you want to. But that whole period that you see that's in the dotted red area, that's where all this period takes place. But hold on a minute. Where do we hear about all of this? Where does all this come into fruition? Well, the only place that we know where it comes to is from this period, we could start with Ibn Ishaq in 765. However, we don't have his material, so we need to go with Ibn Hisham. And then we need to get his biography. His biography doesn't get written down for almost 200 years after the fact. His sayings, the hadith, don't get written down for 240 years after the fact. His you might say the commentaries or the histories, these are the tafsir and the tahqiq, they don't get written down until 923, which is 300 years after the fact. So let's put it on an easier timeline to look at. Here is Muhammad's death. He dies in 632. But everything we know about him, everything we're told about him, what happened, where he did, where he lived, where he moved from, all the receiving of the Quran, all the events that happened in his life, first are written down by this guy here, Ibn Ishaq. That's 765. But see, we don't have any of Ibn Ishaq's material, nothing. What we do know about Muhammad's life comes from this man, Ibn Hisham. He takes what he likes of Ibn Ishaq, throws out most of it, and only retains what he considers to be authentic. So we can pretty well get rid of Ibn Ishaq, because we don't have anything to refer to. We only have what Ibn Hisham tells us existed at that time. Then after him comes al-Waqidi. The two of them are credited with writing down what we call the Sirat Rasulullah, which would be the Sirah of the Prophet of Muhammad. And then you get Al-Bukhari, who introduces the Hadith. So he's the first to introduce the Hadith. He dies in 870. After him comes Sahih Muslim, who dies in 875. After him comes Abu Dawud, who dies in 899. They're the ones that are credited. There are three more, but I've just put those three up there because I'm going to run out of space. For those are the first earliest of the Hadith compilers, the sayings of the Prophet. And then you have Al-Tabari, who's the first one to write down what we know as the tafsir, of the commentaries, and the tahriq, which would be the histories. So take a look at those dates. You notice there's a huge gap, don't you, between Muhammad and when they first appear. 200 years. For 200 years, nothing is written down that we can get our hands on. Now, you might say, okay, so that's, nonetheless, they use isnads, they use names. They use so-and-so who got it from so-and-so, who got it from so-and-so, who got it from the Prophet, the companion of the Prophet himself. Well, all these so-and-sos, they're all dependent on what we call oral tradition. And the problem with oral tradition, as you well know, and as I well know, it can be embellished. It can be accreted. It can be deleted. You can do this in a birthday party when you have kids who you tell someone in one year something, and they tell to the next person, and they tell to the next person. By the time it gets down to the 15th person, what the first person says and what the 15th person says is two different things. We know that as Chinese whispers, or we call that also telephone. I think that's the other name that's given for it. So you can see this is very much a practice that is used by quite a few. This is a problem that is brought up by quite a few people. And this is why I don't go with oral tradition, because oral tradition by definition is open to corruption. 200 years of oral tradition. You can imagine how it got embellished. You can imagine how it got deleted and accreted and how it got changed. And that's why when you finally hear what Muhammad said and did with his biography and with his sayings, they do not fit the 7th century. They do not fit what was actually happening on the ground. And that's why as historians, we need to go back to the 7th century. So here are the problems that the scholars are saying. Concerning these late dates, Islam, according to Humphreys, as we know it, did not exist in the 7th century, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. He's referring to the fact that these don't even get written down until the 9th and 10th century. Ripon and Leicester and Wandsborough all say the Quran probably was not revealed to one man in 22 years, but likely evolved over a period of 50 to 100 years. The conclusion, the history of Islam, at least from the time of the Caliph Abdul Malik and before, is a later fabrication. So folks, can you see what we're dealing with here? We're talking about something that is based on nothing more than hearsay. And that's why the scholars are concerned. If so much of Islam's history was created so late, then why did it take so long to write it down? Remember, when we talk about the history of Jesus, when we look at what he did and what he said, when we look and see what happened during his lifetime, where do we get it from? Do we get it from people that wrote it 200 to 300 years later? No. Well, there are some people that assume so, but we know we get it from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Who are these 4 characters? Well, 3 of them wrote their material within 40 years of his death. The last one, John, wrote it within 60 years of his death. But the 2 of them were eyewitnesses to what they wrote. John and Matthew were actually there with Jesus for the last 3 years. They saw what he did. They heard what he said. And they wrote down what they saw and heard. The other 2 got it from the eyewitnesses. So you can see when we look at the historicity of Jesus and what he did, what he said, and where he went and where he lived, we can trust it because it's written by those who were right with him. The difficulty we have here, and this is why the scholars are concerned, is that everything that we know about Muhammad, everything we know about Mecca, everything we know about Islam, everything we know about these Muslims, and everything we know about the Quran, those 5 areas come not from people that were actually there watching it with their own eyes and hearing it with their own ears. They were getting it from 200 years later and finally writing it down. And so the next question is, why did they write it down while they were living? Why did people who were there at that time actually write it down? Were they not literate? Listen, they controlled Basra, Baghdad, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo by 642, and then from Spain to India, all the way from Spain to India by 685. Are you telling me that nobody between the country of Spain and India knew how to read and write there in the 7th century? Please. So where did they get this from? Where did the biographers get this material that they got it from? Well, they got it from nothing more than hearsay, isnads, these muttons with a list of names after it from where they came. In one case, al-Buhari, he was given 600 of these akhbars, 600,000, excuse me, 600,000 of these akhbars, and he was given the responsibility to throw out those which were fraudulent and keep those which were clear. And so he threw out 98% of it. Only 7,397 did he keep. That means he only retained 2%. This is an 870 in the late 9th century. How did he know what was authentic? How did he know what was fraudulent? He was writing 240 years after Muhammad had died. He was basically retaining only that which he fit his narrative, only that which fit the narrative of the Abbasids, of which he was a part of. And we'll get into that in the 5th lecture, looking at the Abbasids and looking and seeing how Islam really was constructed and why it was constructed and why Muhammad was chosen and why Mecca was chosen and why the Quran was chosen, or how it was even put together. So, can we trust it? No, I would say absolutely not. I do not want to hear people just keep quoting about what the 9th and 10th century biographers and hadith writers and tafsir compilers said. I don't care about them anymore. I've said this many times, you've heard me, because they are much too late and they are much too far away. They're hundreds of miles away and hundreds of years later. Therefore, we need to go back to the 7th century. We need to go back when this all took place. As any historian worth their salt, that's what every historian does. They go back to the 7th century, and we need to find out what happened there. So what are they finding? Well, I'm going to be, in a lot of the material that I'll be using in these next 5 talks, I'll be zeroing in on many of these scholars that you see on the screen there. Wandsborough, out of the School of Oriental and African Studies. He was the one that really blew this whole open when he came out with 2 books in the 1970s called Quranic Studies and Sectarian Milieu. Both of them very difficult to read. Unless you know an awful lot of history and an awful lot of foreign languages, you're going to have a hard time pouring through it. He's very technical, and that's why he is so well known. But he was the first one to say everything we know that we see written on this book called the Quran, everything we see here, a lot of the stories in this book of the Quran, the one I have in my hand here, could not have been written in the 7th century in a place called Hijaz, where we find Mecca and Medina. They couldn't have been that far south, because most of this material is written, comes from documents that were much, much further north. Ooh, I love that. Much, much further north. Primarily from Iraq, from Ctesiphon, the archaic name, the ancient name for what is today Baghdad. From that area. And he was vilified for saying this, but he just looked at textual criticism, looking over at the stories and showing where the roots are and showing where the earliest documents we have for them, and they did not exist that far south nor that early. Dr. Gerald Haunting, that I studied under, he was the one that has written most on the 1st century of Islam, and it was great to be his student at that time. Dr. Patricia Corona, who is a friend of mine, I got to know her when she was at Cambridge University. She used to be at Oxford, wrote a book called Hagerism, and then another book called Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam in 1987, got death threats for what she found there. But see, this woman reads and writes 15 languages, all archaic language. You cannot dispute her on that account. And that's why she is so devastating, because she understands what she's reading. She is one of the few in the world that can really take on this material, because she's going to the original documents. She's going back to where they were written, which is what every historian should do. Now, in her case, she's a linguist. So when I did my first debate 25 years ago, in 1995, with Dr. Jamal Badawi, I went up to her office and we spent the whole afternoon, and she gave me 10 historical questions. Many of them are the same questions I'm asking today. 10 historical questions concerning Muhammad, concerning Mecca, concerning the whole emergence of Islam, the material that I'm even working on and that I'll be introducing in these 5 lectures. She was the one that actually introduced this material. And this was in 1995. I got it from her. And so I said, well, why don't you do this debate? And she said, I am an academic. I have a chair that I have to protect. You aren't. You're nothing more than a missionary. You can say and do and go anywhere you want. You have the freedoms I don't have. Plus, you can use this much more quickly and be able to turn it around much faster than I can do it. So I did the debate, but she did the research. Dr. Andrew Rippin, he is one that has probably taken a lot of this very difficult material and put it down into layman's terminology. Muslims, Their Beliefs and Practices is a great book. If you don't have it, get it and read it, and you'll see where he takes and shows us how Islam had to evolve much, much earlier than what we are giving credit for. Dr. Robert Hoyland is another academic. He is from Oxford University. He reads and writes 18 languages. And I think I have his book right here somewhere. Seeing Islam as Others See It, right there. Hoyland's book right there on my shelf. By the way, these are all the books I'm going through right now. If they're going this way, that means I'm in the process of reading them. If they're this way, I haven't yet got to them. So this is all the stuff I'm working for these lectures that I'm using for the next 5 weeks. So Robert Hoyland is the one that is probably the one that I've really enjoyed the most, because he has actually done what has done us a great favor in taking all these very difficult documents in all these different languages that only he knows. Well, Dr. Patricia Kroner and he know. And then he is translated them and interpreting them and then giving us, putting it out there so that we can come to our conclusions on them. Dr. Yehuda Neville out of Jerusalem, he is the one that's credited with going back and looking at the earliest inscriptions, the rock inscriptions, and just deciphering them and then making and showing the impact that came from them. And his book's right here on Crossroads to Islam, the blue one. Maybe I should hold it up to you. So that's the one that where you can use that. And then the German scholars are who have been probably foremost at looking at the difficulties with the Quranic manuscripts and the earliest manuscripts. And that's Dr. Gunther Lulling, Dr. Puyn, Dr. von Bothmer, and Dr. Oleg. They're the ones that we'll be getting into and be using when I get into the Quranic material in about 4 weeks. So let's go ahead and let's talk about what they found. Well, concerning early Islam, and this is probably this is fascinating because I'm going to give you the conclusions before even I go through and I show you how they came to those conclusions. But let's just go through these 5 conclusions that they've come up with. Number 1, the first Arab inscription referencing Muhammad is not till 691. Now that in and of itself is disturbing. That's 60 years after he died. No one seems to know about him. And no one seems to have written about him, and no one seems to have talked about him. And yet, if he's this important, and he is the center of, and he is the one that from which all this final revelation in Islam is birthed, why is it no one seemed to know about him? Now we're going to talk about those references that do refer to him, and we're going to show you that they do refer to someone named Muhammad, but is it this Muhammad? But that's for a later week. The first reference to the word Muslim, these people called Muslims, is not till the 690s. So what did they call themselves? Well, they used to call themselves Saracens, which is the name that many of the Westerners give them. The Hagarin, that means they are from the line of Hagar. Ishmaelite, from the line of Ishmael, who comes from Hagar. They call themselves Maghreb because they are from the Maghreb, and they call themselves Muhajirun. These are the people of the Hijrah, the people of the Exodus. They were nomadic. They moved from one place to another. So what is that Hijrah? We'll be getting into that later on. The first reference to the name Islam is not found until the Dome of the Rock. In 691, built in 691 by Abd al-Malik. The first reference to Mecca, this is the big one. The first reference to Mecca is not till 741 on the Continuato Byzantia Arabica. That's not till the mid-8th century. Yet this is where Islam began. This is where really humanity began. This is where Adam and Eve were set to in chapter 7, verse 24. This is where Abraham lived in chapter 21, verse 51 to 71 of the Quran. If this is the oldest city in history, why is it there's no reference of it until the mid-8th century? And the first biography of Muhammad, as I said earlier, does not get written down until 833, 200 years too late. Now, what we want to do next is to talk about Mecca. We're going to talk about Mecca here. We're going to talk about the Qibla, but to do before that, we've got to talk about Mecca. And I have 3 problems with Mecca. The first problem is the problem with geography. When you look, and this comes out of a book that Dan Gibson wrote called Quranic Geography. If you don't have it, get it. If you don't want to pay for it, you can get it on PDF by just paying $15 online. Go up to Dan Gibson's site and just order it. It's a great book to have. It was written in 2011. A little bit out of date, but the material in it, the great thing about it, because it's historical, it's talking about history, that never goes out of date. And what he noticed when he looked at the Quran, and he's been studying it for 25 years, he noticed that there were 9 places that are named in it, but 3 places, 65 geographical references, but only 9 were named. And the 3 that come up more than any other are the word Ad, which is the name for the people of Uz, the biblical Uz. And that was found 23 times in the Quran. There also comes up over and over again the name for Thamud, who are known as, that's what we would know as the Nabateans. That's found 24 times in the Quran. And the name Midian, we were the Midianites, that's found 7 times in the Quran. Now, what's fascinating, take a look and see where these 3 places are. Look at the map there on the right, and you'll see Ad, Thamud, and Midian are way up north. They're way up in what is today Jordan and real close to Petra. They should be down south in Mecca. If this prophet was having this contact with these people from these 3 areas on a daily basis, how could he go up 600 miles to see them unless he had a helicopter? So you can see that the problem immediately shows itself that there are some geographical difficulties with the Quran concerning it taking place or existing in the city of Mecca. What's more, when you look on a map, now this is a facsimile of a Byzantine map from the 7th century, and you notice what's missing. You can see where the question mark is. Those are the trade routes. Here's another picture of the trade routes from the 7th century. What's missing again? It's right where the question mark is. That's where Mecca is. Mecca is not on these trade routes. Here's an official map from the 6th century. Where's Mecca? Mecca just doesn't exist on this map. Here's another map from the 7th century. You notice Mecca doesn't exist on this map either. Take a look at this map. Here's another 7th century map. You notice Mecca's not there. Where is Mecca? Should be on all these maps. One more map from the 7th century. Mecca is just non-existent. On any of these maps, you won't see Mecca. Now, let's go back to Montgomery Watt. Dr. Montgomery Watt in the last century tried to understand why Mecca was important. And he said the reason for its importance had to do with what was happening historically in the 7th century. And he mentioned that all the trade that was coming from the east, so it's coming from China and India and places like that, had to come to India, to the west coast. There you can see the west coast. And this is a map I should have said, this is a map from the 7th century. So this is what it would look like in the 7th century. So you can see Ctesiphon is named there where Baghdad should be. And so this is his theory, that the trade used to come across from the west coast of India because of the Hindu Kush and because of the Himalayas. It couldn't go up north. So they had to bring the trade to the west coast of India. And they took it from the west coast of India across the Arabian Sea, up through the Persian Gulf, and then across through what is today Iraq and then Syria over to the Mediterranean world, because they had to get it to the Mediterranean world. So that was the trade route. Then the Sassanians and the Byzantines started warring with each other in the 5th century and in the 6th century, up until the 7th century. So because of this conflict that was going up north there, that shut down the Persian Gulf. So the trade could no longer go that route because there was too much warfare going on. So there was a dilemma. Montgomery Watt said that the way to solve that was to go, therefore, redirect the trade this way over to Aden, down here in the southern part of Arabia, and then send that trade straight up through Arabia up to Gaza in the north. So here's the first problem, however. Aden, and this is what you can see, this is where Patricia Crona saw this difficulty right away. In fact, this really is in her book, Mecca and Trade and the Rise of Islam. This is her argument. Take a look, and let's look at that trade that goes up on the Western Plateau. Starts at Aden, goes up through Najran and Sana, goes up to Taif, and then from Taif, notice it comes down off the plateau down to Mecca, which is about 1,000 meters off. Now, it looks like, on this map, it looks like Mecca is on the coast. It's not on the coast. It's about 50 miles in from the coast. It's just that's where they had to write it. And then from here, it then had to go back up to the Western Plateau to Yathrib, and then continue up to Gaza in the north. And she says, hold on a minute, take a look at that map, and you will see that there's a deviation there. It should not be on the trade route. What's more, why would you go to Taif, come down 1,000 meters, then go back up to Yathrib and continue on? And so that's why she decided to do some research on Mecca, and she then wrote her book of her findings, Meccan Trade and the Rise of Islam, in 1987, where she looked at what all the Muslims have been saying, what the traditions say, and even what Montgomery Watt was saying, and that is that Mecca became important because of all the spices, 15 spices that it controlled. She went back through and did a survey on every one of those 15 spices and found that not one of those spices went up the Western Plateau. The only place in Arabia that even had any spices was way down around the southern part of Arabia, called the Hadramat, but where Yemen and Oman is today, and that was frankincense and myrrh. The other spices all came from Africa, over there on the west. None of them were in Arabia. Arabia was not a country known for spices, and certainly there's no reference in any of these trading documents for any place called Mecca at all. Remember, she went back to the trading documents. So she came up with another theory. Because of this problem here, she came up with this theory. Well, let's go ahead and bring the trade down to what the Montgomery thought was Aden. But she says, no, he didn't stop at Aden for one very good reason. Take a look at the map. Where do you see she is going? Well, take a look at the Red Sea. There's a waterway that goes up the west coast of Arabia. Why in the world would you stop and unload your goods in Aden? Because she found out if you unload your goods in a city called Aden and you go 50 miles by land, it would cost the same amount as going 1,250 miles by sea, which is the length of the Red Sea there. It would be the same cost. It would be prohibitively expensive to take any goods by land. And so she went back to the trading documents, as what a historian should do, what Montgomery Watt should have done. And she went and looked at all the documents and looked at the receipts. And she found that the name that came up over and over and over again was this name, Agilis, the city of Agilis, which is today in Eritrea. That's the city that comes up over and over again with all the trading receipts, proving that all the trade was maritime. It did not go across the Arabian Peninsula, for it would have been too expensive, and it certainly did not have a deviation going down to Mecca. It remained always on sea. We do that even today. If you look at all the big ships that are going across the world, why is it they put almost of our goods on ships? Because it's the cheapest way to go. In the old days, you could use the wind. It didn't cost you a thing. And in the course, if you're taken by land, you have to have camels. You have to feed the camels. You have to protect the camels. You have to protect your goods. And that's why you then have to have oases about every day's length walk. And that's why it's so difficult to go across the deserts by land, but not by sea. You can go anywhere by sea. It is free. It is open. It is easy. And it is cheap. Now, the other problem with Mecca is the wrong references to it. There's only one reference to it in the Quran at all. The entire Quran only has one reference to Mecca, and it's in chapter 48, verse 24. And there you can see it listed there. And he it is who hath withheld men's hand from you, and hath withheld your hands from them in the valley of Mecca, after he had made your victors over there. So it doesn't really say much about it. And that's the only reference in the Quran for this city. What's more, notice it says it's in a valley. In a valley. Well, what we also know about this place where the prophet lived. And remember, every time it talked about where this prophet lived, it mentioned that the place of the prophet, or the environment of the prophet. And it refers a lot of things to where he lived. It says that according to Ibn Ishaq and al-Bukhari, that it's in a valley and it has a parallel valley. According to al-Bukhari, that it has streams going through it. According to Surah 37, it says that it's outside or the ruins, the pillar of salt, referring to the wife of Lot. In al-Bukhari, it talks about it has fields. According to Sahih Tirmidhi and Bukhari and also Tabari, it has trees, grass-free, and clay and loam. And then according to Surah 6, 141, and also 16 and Surah 80, it has olive trees with mountains overlooking the Kaaba, according to Ibn Ishaq and al-Bukhari. But when you look at Mecca, it does not have a valley or a parallel valley. There's no streams going through it. Outside the ruins, there's not a pillar of salt. It does not have fields, trees, grass, fruit, or clay alone. And it certainly does not have olive trees. There are no olive trees outside of the Mediterranean. The only place where olive trees grow is in the Mediterranean, and that's 600 miles further north. So none of these listed above make sense for Mecca because it's much too arid and much too dry. The third problem is the QIBLA. If Mecca is wrong, then the QIBLA is going to be wrong. Now remember, the QIBLA is the direction of prayer. And this is where all Muslims pray today. They all pray towards Mecca. Chapter 2, verse 143 to 150, it says that the direction of the QIBLA was changed. Most Muslims say that this happened in 624, but it doesn't say where. It doesn't say where it's changed to. So archaeology does support this change, but not from Jerusalem to Mecca, as Muslims suggest, but someplace further north and much, much later. So where is it? Well, back in 1905, two scholars, Dr. Creswell and Dr. Fehrbari, were going to old or ancient mosques, two in what is today Iraq and one in what is today Egypt. And they were going to these old mosques, one outside, one in Mosul, which is the mosque in not too far from where is today Kufa. And I'm sorry, and the one that close to it called the Kufa Mosque. So you have both of these two mosques. They dug down to the original floor plans, and when they got down to the original foundations of these mosques, they found that the Qibla, the original Qiblas of these mosques, were facing west. They went outside of Cairo and they went to the garrison town of Fustat, which is in Egypt. And they noticed that that mosque that was dated to 641, when they went to its original floor plans, they noticed the Qibla, the direction of the prayer, was facing east. Let's look at a map and see what I'm talking about. So there you have Wasit and Kufa, there in the Mediterranean, between the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers in the Mesopotamia, are facing west in the 7th century. The one in Egypt is facing east, but they should be facing south. So in 1905, they saw that there was a problem, and they just thought, well, they were facing Jerusalem. And I remember when I did a debate in 1998 with Abdul Green, I brought this up and I pointed this out, and he says, Jay, you're completely wrong. Look at the Wasit Mosque, look at the Kufa Mosque, look at those original Qiblas, and they are not to Jerusalem at all. You're 3 to 5 degrees off. And I thought, oh, okay, well, he knows something I don't know. I wasn't aware of that. That was in 1998 I did that debate. I wish I'd had Gibson's work back that time, because if you look and see where 3 to 5 degrees are off, that is true. They aren't facing Jerusalem. I thought they were facing Jerusalem. We'll see what Dan Gibson finds out, and we'll find that the 3 and the 5 degrees puts it directly to Petra. We have also documentary evidence. Jacob Edessa in 688, some say it's 705. Nonetheless, it's in around that time period, refers and says that from all this, it is clear that it is not to the south that the Jews and the Maghreb would be the Arabs, here in the regions of Syria pray, but towards Jerusalem or the Kaaba, the patriarchal places of the races. So he didn't have GPS to help him, so he thought that the reason they were facing west and they were facing east is because they were facing Jerusalem, as I thought in my 1998 debate. Little did I know that with GPS coordination, you can get a lot more accurate telemetry. And of course, he was saying this in the late 7th century, early 8th century. As early as that, I should say, he actually got it right. But why were they not facing south? Well, what we need to do is we need to go to Dan Gibson, because he is the one that has done the germinal work on this. And he is the one that from 1979 to 2004, that's for 25 years, he did his formal research on the Qiblas. Now he's still continuing with this. He's still going back to the Middle East. He's still going back to these countries, and he's still finding old mosques. He didn't plan to do this. He just was happening. He happened on a number of mosques, and he was looking at their Qiblas, and he noticed that none of them were facing Mecca. So he decided to do some more research. And as a result, he went to over 100 mosques. And there's a picture of Dan Gibson, and I just want to show you his books that he came out with. I already showed you Quranic Geography. Now this one here, which you can get online. The Nabateans is the one that he started with, and this is the first book he wrote. He actually wrote this as a tourist guide. It was written for the government of Jordan, and he did it under commission. But as he was looking into the Nabateans, he noticed that the Nabateans actually have an awful lot to say concerning how Islam began, and we'll be coming to that at a later time. But the book that probably did the most damage was this book. This came out in 2017, so it's only been out 3 years. Get it. It's very colorful. It has lots of pictures inside, and it's full of data, full of material, full of interesting, not only just interesting, but exciting material that completely confronts this notion that Mecca was the center of Islam, or that Mecca was even the center of the Qiblas. So let's look at his findings. For some of you, this is review. For others, this is new. So I'm not going to go into all of it. I'm just going to do a quick snapshot so that you can get up to speed, because we want to get into the new material next. So when you look at his mosques, you can also go up on his site, Dan Gibson's, just go up and put it in on YouTube and look at The Sacred City, which is a documentary on his findings. He noticed that all the mosques that he found up until 706, so every mosque up until the 8th century, up until 706, and he was looking from 624 all the way up to 706, 17 mosques that he's been able to uncover. Every one of them from Medina, Guangzhou in China, Cherman in India, Jami al-Hamair, Al-Kabir in Syria, the Fustat in Egypt, the Dome of the Rock in Israel, the Humayna Mosque in Jordan, Amman Mosque in Jordan, the Grand Sana Mosque in Yemen, the Kirbat al-Minya of Israel, just to name a few. Every one of them are facing Petra. Not Mecca, not Medina, not Jerusalem, but Petra. Up until 706, there's not one mosque facing Mecca. Here is the coordinates. There you can see Petra. Look how accurate they are. All of the 17 Petran Qiblas before 706, except for 2, fall within 45-mile dotted circle, proving how accurate they were. Now remember, these are Qiblas that are coming away from as far away in the east, this direction, as far away as the Guangzhou Mosque in China, as far away as the Sherman Mosque in Kerala. Johnson, that's your area. And yet they were all facing Petra. Not one is facing Mecca in the 7th century or the early 8th century. So there's the first Petran mosque. Just take a look at how far away they are and yet how accurate they were. Then there was a second Qibla that was introduced, and this is what he called the between Qibla. And if you take a line from Petra to Mecca and take the halfway mark, that's where all these mosques were facing. They start to appear in 706 in the 8th century, and they go up till 772. Why were they facing in between? There's nothing there. There's no city there. There's no building there. There's no mountain there. There's not even a rock there. It's just sand. So why are they facing that point? We're going to answer that. Hold on. And then he finally came across Meccan Qibla. In fact, the first one that faces Mecca is not till 727. Remember, Muhammad died in 632. The Qibla was canonized in 624, and yet we don't find any mosque facing Mecca until 727. That's over 100 years later. Over 100 years later. And then by 876, every mosque is then facing Mecca until today. But that's too late. That's much too late. The fourth Qibla is what he calls the parallel Qiblas, which are all the mosques in North Africa and also in Spain. They're all facing a line that is parallel to Petra and Mecca. They're not facing Mecca, they're not facing Petra, they're facing a line parallel. What's going on here? We'll answer that. Hold on. So which were the most accurate Qiblas? Modern scholars believe that the variety of Qibla directions were due to the inability of the ancient Arabs finding an accurate Qibla direction. Modern scholars simply quoted earlier Islamic scholars concerning this theory. They assumed that the Meccan Qiblas were more accurate. Now, with a much more accurate GPS technology, we know that the earliest Arabs had the most accurate Qiblas. Take a look at this graph. This is from his book. So which is the most accurate? Take a look and you will see that the most accurate were the between ones. They were less than a degree off in accuracy. The second most accurate were the Petran Qiblas, 2.9 degrees of accuracy, 1.9 if we take away the worst two. The next most accurate would be the parallel Qiblas. They were 3.5 degrees of accuracy, but the worst ones, the ones that were the least accurate, were the Meccan Qiblas, 4.78, which debunks that whole theory that the Meccans knew their material better because they had better mathematics. Not at all. And we'll talk more about that when we get into this debate between King and Gibson. Now, why Mecca? What's the significance? Well, it was a sanctuary for the Nabateans between the 2nd century BC up until 713. And it was also the sanctuary for the Umayyads between 661 and 749, the first empire, Islamic empire, although we're going to debunk that as well. Remember, the Nabateans are absolutely important because they are the ones that give us what we now know today as Arabic, and they also give us the name Allah and Alat, which we'll talk about later. But what's fascinating is Mecca is missing, but Petra is in these maps. Remember these maps I showed you before? Mecca is not there, but Petra is there. In every one of these maps, take a look and you will see, in fact, let's go back to that one there. Can you notice it's at the center of the trade? Both these maps that are the trade routes map, Petra is at the center of the trade. It's not there in this map, but it is there in that, but Petra is. Mecca is not there in this map, but Petra is. So in every one of these maps, Petra is very well known. And it's important, is very clear, because when you go to Petra, if any of you have been there, you will see it has these beautiful carved buildings, which is a city of tombs and temples. Tombs and temples for who? For the Nabateans. What's more, Petra has the vegetation that we find in the Quran and the traditions. Note where Petra is and what it has. It's in a valley. Look at the map on the right. You can see it's in a valley with a parallel valley, which supports Ibn Ishaq and Al-Buhari. It has a stream. Al-Bukhari talks about it. It has more than one stream. Outside its ruins are the pillar of salt. If there was to be a pillar of salt, there was no, it would be right outside of Petra. It has fields, according to Al-Bukhari. It is the place the prophet has, the place of the prophet, not Mecca. It doesn't say the name, but it is the place of the prophet, which has trees, grass, fruit, clay, loam. All of them are there in Petra. Most importantly, it has olive trees. The thing you need to have is olive trees, and there you find it in Petra, with mountains overlooking the Kaaba. Petra has all the items listed above from both the Quran and traditions. Thus, could Petra be the place that they are all referring to? Also, as I said earlier, it's where the people of Ad, the people of Thamud, and the people of Midian are. So all these people who are there with having contact with this prophet from that place, they're all right around there. They're all within striking distance. In fact, that would make sense then, that this prophet from this place would have all kinds of contact with them. Why? Well, because he is right next to them. No helicopter needed there. So, now, historical significance. Why then was Petra important? Well, to do that, you need to ask what was really happening. And here's a possible scenario. Now, I put September 2020 because I could change this within another year. This is the exciting thing, and also one of the problems of historical criticism. You have to go with what comes. You have to go with what comes to the fore. You have to go with where the evidence takes you. So here in September 2020, this is what we're saying. To make sense of all this, we will need to begin with Abdullah ibn Zubair, the governor of Petra under Abdul Malik, the Umayyad Caliph from 685 to 705. He is there in Petra, and he gets disillusioned. He gets upset with the Umayyads, who are way up further north, way up in Damascus. So he rebels against the Umayyad power. He rebels against the father of Abdul Malik, and also against Abdul Malik himself. And he then rebels, and he leaves. He leaves Petra. What's fascinating, the question needs to be asked is, why is it that they were way up in Damascus? Why, if they were the first Muslims, why weren't they down in Medina or Mecca, the Hijaz, which was the birthplace of Islam? What are they doing way up in Damascus? No one's really answered that question. So he rebels against them, starts a second civil war, and destroys the Kaaba in Petra. And then he flees Petra, the Zubair, and he takes the Black Stone. Hugely important. No one's looked at the Black Stone. The Black Stone is on the Kaaba today. Now, it's not one stone anymore. It's been broken up, and it has about 7 or 8 little pieces, if you look at it carefully, inside this big piece of tar. That's why it's black still today. So this Black Stone is taken by him. To understand why the Black Stone is important, we're going to get into it possibly in another 4 weeks. You need to do a historical survey of the Black Stone. It is a hugely significant stone for the Nabateans. The Nabateans were the ones that controlled the Black Stone. They knew about the Black Stone because they believed wherever the Black Stone was, God's presence was there. So whenever the Black Stone leaves, God's presence leaves with the Black Stone. So when Zubair takes the Black Stone with them and flees Petra, he takes God's presence out of Petra, and he flees down to the south. We aren't told where he flees to. Perhaps Mecca. It looks like that's where he ends up. Now, he needs allies, and so he uses the Abbasids, who are up there in Ctesiphon, what is today Baghdad, and they are also in control of Kufa, and they join the rebellion and support Zubair. Now, let's just take a look and put it on a map so you can understand what I'm talking about. That is Damascus there that I've just circled in black, and that is the political capital of the Umayyads. And according to what we now know historically, that has been the capital since Muawiyah really created it as his capital in 661. He is the beginning of the Umayyad dynasty, which is fascinating because we can't find anything about Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the 4 rightly guided kings. We can't find any reference to them outside of the traditions. Isn't that interesting? So we do know about Muawiyah. There's an awful lot. We're going to talk about him next week quite a bit. And he's living up there in Damascus. Why is he not living way down in Mecca? So his sanctuary is Petra. All of the Nabateans' sanctuary is Petra, and so are the Umayyads. They are there in Petra. That's where they pray toward. That's why all these mosques that Gibson has found are facing Petra. Baghdad up here, it says Ctesiphon because this is a 7th century map. It then changes its name to Baghdad later on. But let's just say Baghdad today so we can know what we're talking about. Baghdad is where the Abbasids were centered, and they hate the Umayyads. They want nothing to do with the Umayyads. They then ally themselves with Zubair, and they make Mecca their sanctuary, down here, circled in purple. So there you have the two political headquarters, circled in black, and then you have the two sanctuaries, the golden one in Petra and the purple one in Mecca. Can you then understand we have two empires that are vying with each other, opposing each other, one who is in power on the west and the other one who wants to be in power in the east. Now, this is why you need to look at the political context. While this is going on, Abd al-Malik, who is the Umayyad Caliph and ruling from 685 to 705 in Damascus, he needs to have this Arab identity. For 40 years now, they have controlled the Hijaz, but they've also, by the time he comes to power, they now have from Tripoli in the west all the way to Afghanistan in the east, all this line. I'm sorry, not Tripoli, no, that was before him. From all the way from Andalusia, which is Spain in the west, all the way to India in the east is now under his control. That whole swath of land is under control. Now, what's interesting is in order for him to run these cities, and a lot of the cities were controlled by Jews and Christians because they were much more literate than the Arabs. The Arabs were mostly nomadic. And that's why they used the Jews and Christians. They called them Maulas or Mawalis. And for 40 years, they have been using the Jews and Christians to run their cities for them. But here's the problem. The Jews and the Christians, they had a prophetic line. The Arabs did not have a prophetic line. The Jews and the Christians had an identity because they also had a scripture. The Arabs did not have a scripture. They needed to have a prophetic line and they needed to have a scripture. What are you going to do? That's where Abd al-Malik decides to do something about it. So what did he do? Well, when you look and see, the first thing he did was to go to Jerusalem and build this enormous structure called the Dome of the Rock in 691. Why in the world would he build that in Jerusalem? Why didn't he build that in Mecca? Why didn't he build that in Medina? Why didn't he build that in Damascus where he lived? Why in Jerusalem? Well, take a look at where it's built. It's built up on the hill, overlooking the Church of the Sepulchre. So there's the Dome of the Rock, and there's the Church of the Sepulchre down there. It looks down on top of the Church of the Sepulchre. What's the significance of the Church of the Sepulchre? That was the sanctuary for the Byzantine Christianity, the great superpower of its day, the biggest authority and also the biggest competition that Abd al-Malik had against him. Here you can see the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is built in 709, later on, after Abd al-Malik. It was built during the time of his son Walid. But certainly you can see immediately why this is important. So he employs Byzantine architects to build and uses Byzantine architecture. It's much larger and more prominent than any other building of its day. And it sits above the Church of the Sepulchre. It's situated in the holiest city for Jews and Christian. That's why it's non-Damascus or Mecca. Now, when you talk to a Muslim, they'll say it was built to commemorate the Miraj, the night journey from Muhammad, going from Mecca up to Jerusalem and going up through the seven heavens to meet Allah. That's what they say was built. But let's look and see if that is so. Let's look at the inscriptions. Now, when you look at the Dome of the Rock, it has been destroyed and rebuilt 11 times. The only original part of the Dome of the Rock is where those two green arrows are, the two ambulatories. That's the only original part of the building. Everything else has been built around it and above it since the 7th century, since 691. In fact, the structure that we're looking at today was rebuilt in 1876. That's a little over 100 years ago, so it's very new. So you have to go back to the earliest structure, those two ambulatories, those two circular octagonal arches that you see where the two green arrows are. And you need to look at the inscriptions. You need to look at the Arabic inscriptions that are there along those ambulatories. Now, what do they say? Well, you will notice that they are Quranic references, yet they all attack the Trinity and Jesus' divinity. Isn't that interesting? Chapter 4, verse 171, sorry. O people of the scripture, do not exaggerate in your religion, nor utter aught concerning Allah save the truth. The Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, was only a messenger of Allah, and his word which he had conveyed unto Mary, and a spirit from him. So believe in Allah and his messengers, and say not three, cease. It is better for you. Allah is only one God. For is it removed from his transcendent majesty that he should have a son? Well, who is that attacking? Well, it's attacking Jesus' divinity, it's attacking the Trinity, and it's attacking the fact that he is, you can see that he is, that he is the Son of God. So it's attacking those three things. Chapter 17, verse 111 is also up there. Praise be to God, who hath not taken unto himself a son. There again, it's attacking his sonship. And who hath no partner. It's attacking the fact that Jesus could have a partner. That's in chapter 5, verse 72 also. And in the sovereignty, nor hath he any protecting friend through dependence. He's not dependent on it. He's above every one of us. So you can see that is attacking the person of Jesus Christ. And then we get to Surah 112. There is no God but God. There is the beginning of the Shahada. He is one. He has no associates. That's not part of the Shahada today. So what's that doing there? Well, it's attacking the fact that Jesus would be the associate of God. This is Byzantine Christianity. It's attacking their theology. It's attacking his divinity. Say he is God, the one God, the eternal, besought of all. He begetteth nor was begotten. Again, that's attacking John 3:16, Jesus, the begotten Son of God. And there is none comparable to him. And then Muhammad is the messenger of God. Now, there is much dispute as to whether or not that is Muhammad the man, or that is just the praised one is the messenger of God. Could this also be referring to Jesus as the messenger of God? Who knows? We don't know, but I would suggest that we need to at least bring that up there as a possibility. So you can see, look at these verses. These are nothing to do with the Miraj. There's not one reference about Muhammad going up to the seven heavens or about him coming on the Burak, the winged horse. There's nothing on the original inscriptions about that event, the Miraj. So when Muslims say that that was why that building was built, I would suggest they look at these inscriptions and see why it was built and where it was built. It was built there for a reason, to confront the whole notion of who Jesus is, his divinity, the Trinity, and his sonship. Those are the four areas that stand against everything we believe about Jesus Christ. Isn't it fascinating that the whole initial attack against the West was against Jesus Christ? Islam was begun as a rejection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Islam was created to attack our Lord, to attack his divinity, and to attack the Trinity. Fascinating. History shows us why it all began. You need to also go to the protocols, and this comes out of Yehuda Nevo's book that I have here, Islam, the Crossroads to Islam, where he looks and he follows the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate from the Sufyani period, the Sufyani family from 661 up until 680. And he looks at the protocols, because they did write these protocols, these official documents. But they don't mention anything about Islam or about Muslims. They don't mention anything about Muhammad or a book called the Quran or a city called Mecca at all in any of these protocols. And then we get to the Marwanid protocols, and this is where the Marwanid family come in, and they come in around 680 with Marwan himself, the first. His son Abdul Malik then comes to power in 681, and then in 691 the protocols suddenly change overnight. In 691 the protocols change overnight, and now we have the Bismillah al-Rahman al-Rahim, and when we have al-Muhammad al-Alhamdulillah, and then we have the Shahada. La ilaha illallah Muhammadur Rasulullah is then introduced there in 691, and it's introduced overnight. And from that time on, you see the Bismillah and the Shahada then introduced on those protocols. So this is the same time that the Dome of the Rock is being built. Meanwhile, while that's happening, the coins are introduced. Take a look at the coins. We're going to get into this next week, so I'm not going to unpack it too much. But when you look at the coins, you will see that you first have these Byzantine coins, and you can see that they have the emperor with the two of his retainers, and then you have the Byzantine cross. When you start looking at those, the Sufyani coins, you look at them, you'll notice that there you can see Mu'awiyah holding a cross, which suggests to me that Mu'awiyah was still a Christian, and certainly these coins are still Christian coins. Until you get to Abdul Malik, and then he introduces his image on this coin here in 692, around 692, 693, takes off the image of the cross, takes it off, and it's a slap in the face to the Byzantines. And then finally, in 696, introduces the Shahada, the Bismillah, and all these references against Jesus and his divinity. Fascinating. And that's in 696. You need to look at the coins, and you can see the whole sequence of what is going on. We'll get into that next week. Unfortunately, in 689, Petra was destroyed by Ibn Zubair. So a new sanctuary was needed. So he flees from Petra, and he flees from here and flees possibly down to here in defiance of the Umayyads and of Petra itself. Now we know something about Mecca because we have an inscription from 697 there. You can see it on the right. Interestingly, this has now been destroyed. In just the last 2 years, the Arabs, the Saudi Arabians have destroyed this inscription. You can't find it any longer, I think because of what we're now finding out about it. It's dated to 697 because it says 72 years after the Hijrah, which is we're going to get into what they mean by the Hijrah, what happened in 622. We'll get into that. And it says that it mentions the Masjid al-Haram, which is what Muslims believe is the Kaaba today, the Masjid al-Haram, the place, the forbidden place of bowing, and that it was constructed in Mecca. Wait a minute, a second Masjid al-Haram in 697? I thought that was in Mecca. I thought Mecca was always there. This is a second one? The Abbasids and Zubair, with their sanctuary in Mecca, then demand allegiance from the surrounding tribes. And you can see why they demand allegiance, because they have the black stone. He who has the black stone has God's presence. And that's why all the people start then redirecting their pilgrimages down to Mecca and stop going to Petra, because no longer is God there. He is wherever the black stone is. Mecca was possibly chosen by the rebel Ibn Zubair, and thus from Baghdad and Kufa, the Abbasids, in defiance of the Umayyads and in defiance of Petra. So you have two empires that are competing to create an Arabi sanctuary. In 708, the Zamzam well was lost. So there was a number of years where the first Zamzam well in Petra did not exist. And then suddenly it reappears in Mecca. In 713, the Umayyads, which are known earlier as the Nabateans, their sanctuary in Petra was completely destroyed by an earthquake. So now by the early 8th century, Petra has nothing to offer anybody. There has no black stone, and it is now physically destroyed by this earthquake. Thus, a new place is needed desperately. Well, we haven't found any mosques facing Mecca that early. In fact, the very first mosque facing Mecca is not till 727. But the Hadith tell us that there were two Meccas. Christian writers speak of the city of Mecca in Paran in Jordan. Thus, could that be the first Mecca? Hold on, we'll talk more about that in 4 weeks. Now we can see why there are 4 Qiblas. Why? Well, these two empires are competing for people's allegiance. The earliest Qiblas were facing Petra, had allegiance to the Umayyads in Damascus. All the Qiblas facing Mecca are those who allied themselves with the Abbasids. Two different empires demanding two different allegiances. Al-Hajjaj kills Ibn Zubair, so cannot rely on Mecca, and it is his mosque which face in between the other two sanctuaries from 706 onwards, waiting to see who would finally win out in his ascendancy. So basically, he was being clever. All the mosques that come under his control, he demands that their Qibla is between Petra and Mecca, in a place where nothing exists. Hedging his bets, waiting to see who is going to finally take over. This is the same idea of those in North Africa and Andalusia. They're not talking with Al-Hajjaj, but they decide to have parallel mosques. They don't show their allegiance to either empire either, so that they have mosques facing parallel to each sanctuary. Thus, these groups wait to see which side would control before giving their allegiance to either. When the Abbasids finally overpowered the Umayyads in 749, most of the Qiblas then faced Mecca with a few holdouts until 822, after which they all faced Mecca up to the present time. So these Qiblas were chosen for political purposes, nothing to do with religious expediency. Possible scenario. Here's a what if. This is what I think is going on. Now that the Muslims have a prophet, Muhammad, a revelation of the Quran, and a sanctuary in Mecca, they then need a history, because these were all then created in the 8th century. So they need a history. That's why it's in the early 9th century that a siddha is finally introduced by Ibn Hisham. It takes them that much time for the Abbasids to create that siddha, to create the material, to create their narrative. But it takes another 50 years for them to get the hadith to put together, where al-Bukhari is given 600,000 of these. He is told to whittle them down so they all fit the narrative that they want, and that's why he only ends up with 7,397, throws out 98% of it. It takes him another 50 more years before the tafsir is finally written. This is in 923. That's the 10th century. So by the 9th and 10th century, they then now have the book, the man, the place, and the story. And a new religion is formed and growing. Yet this did not take place in a mere 22 years, like Muslims like to tell us, but evolved over a period of 200 to 300 years. So, the story of Petra and Mecca is one of political intrigue. An old kingdom of sophistication and amazing engineering feats gives way to a clash of two competing empires, the Umayyads, replaced by the Abbasids. Each has its own sanctuary and its own political capital. Those who lived in the two empires are forced to give allegiance to one or the other, or in some cases both, while others on the fringes remain neutral. As one group rebels and takes the black stone in God's presence to a new location, the balance of power begins to shift. Eventually, that power shift grows and grows until finally the Abbasids wrest power from the Umayyads and create the Islam we now find today. Material. Now, what I'm going to do now is introduce the new material. I've done a review. For some of you, you've heard all this before. This is not new because we did go through this in our talks over when we had those breakout lockdown talks between March and July earlier in the year for the pandemic. So some of you, what I've just gone through is old hat. What I'm going to be introducing now is not. This is new, and this is one reason why we're doing these lectures, to bring you up to date with some of the new. And we'll be doing these in the future as well as new research is done. We need to make sure that we share it with you so that you can use it. So let's go right into the PowerPoint and let's share screen. And let's start with, what about Petra itself? Can it be the former Mecca? What are the new findings we have found about this old city? Well, when you look at the valleys in Mecca, they just don't exist. And remember, the Islamic traditions say that Mecca is in a valley. In fact, the Quran, chapter 48, verse 24, says it's in a valley. But take a look at these maps. Can you see there is no valley there where Mecca is? Not in a valley, but Petra, now look at that map on the right there, is in a valley and has a parallel valley. You can see the two parallel valleys there next to each other, looking down on top of Petra from above. So that fits the traditional account and also fits the Quranic reference. Petra fits the biblical account as well. Hagar is in a valley going to one mountain and then the other, which fits Petra. And that's Marwa and Safa that we're going to talk about later. Abraham comes to talk to her and turns the corner out of sight, which is exactly what we would find with the cliffs in Petra known as Thanaya, or the turning to the right. Take a look at this image. You can see the Thanayas there, those long strands, green strands. Those are the Thanayas that would make sense if Abraham had come to find Hagar there. What's also interesting is that you take a look at this structure here that I've pictured, and that's the temple of Dushara. Who is Dushara? He is the senior god of the Nabatean pantheon. What's fascinating, that is his name, but that is not his title. His title is Ilaha, the god, which is where Allah comes from. And that's why on the coins that we're going to see next week, that name appears on the coin, because they are the one that introduced that name of God. So Allah, the name for God, the name of God in the Quran, is not a name. It's nothing more than a title, the God. And where does it derive from? It derives from Petra, which most of Arabic that we use today comes from Nabatean Aramaic, which is, again, the language they use in Petra. Also interesting is that when you go to chapters 53, or Surah 53, ayah 19 to 20, known as the Satanic verses, we have the reference to the three goddesses, Alat, Al-Uzza, and Al-Manat. But Alat is the feminine form of Allah, means the goddess. Again, it's a title, the goddess. But Alat is the generic title for Al-Uzza, the goddess, who is the wife of Allah. So Allah has a wife. I had no idea, because I always thought God was one and has no consort. In chapter 6, verse 101 and 102 in the Quran, it's very clear that Allah does not have a wife, has no consort. Yet here, the very God that we see the Muslims using and that Islam uses and that the Quran uses is derived from the Nabatean god, Dushara, whose title is Ilaha, or Allah, who has a wife named Al-Uzza, whose title is Allah, the feminine form of Allah. So how could God be one if he has a wife? Petra is also where the best looking Kaaba is found. Now, there is a square in the center of Petra. Take a look at that picture on the right, which looks like a Kaaba. See, it's larger than the present day Kaaba in Mecca. Why? Well, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Azraqi was a 9th century Islamic commentator and historian and author of the book Kitab Akhbar Mecca, the book of the reports about Mecca. Now, he's reporting of the material that was given to him. So he's not the one that is actually writing it. He is taking the documents that he was given about this place called Mecca. And he gives the measurements that he has received of the Masjid al-Haram. Remember, he doesn't call it the Kaaba, he calls it the Masjid al-Haram, the forbidden place of bowing. And the earlier Kaaba, during Muhammad's time, And it has the exact same measurements as the square, which is in Petra today that you see encircled there. It has that measurement. The later built Kaaba in Mecca was built at a later date and does not have those dimensions. There you can see it on the right. So the reference points to the measurements of what the Kaaba should be fits Petra, not Mecca. Also, Al-Zaraqi talks about the temples that were built around the Kaaba, immediately around it, attached to it. If you look at the Petra Kaaba, you will see it does have temples around it. You can see that in the picture. The Meccan Kaaba, looking at the earlier pictures, now here's a picture from the 1800s to 1887, though two different pictures in the 19th century. The Kaaba stands completely alone. There are no temples around it, suggesting, therefore, that Al-Zaraqi is not talking about that Kaaba or Masjid al-Haram. When you go to Mecca today, you will find that long corridor known as the Safa and Marwa. Those are the two mountains. According to chapter 2, verse 158, they refer to these two mountains where the pilgrims run back and forth. And you can see in the picture on the bottom left where they're commemorating the search by Hagar for water. And she's looking for water for her son Ishmael. And she runs between these two mountains back and forth. And these are supposedly the two mountains that are there in Mecca today, Safa and Marwa. But when you take a look at them, Those don't look like mountains to me. They look like little pieces of rock. They're only about 15 to 20 feet high. If these are mountains, why are they so small? And it looks like they've been placed there at a later date. Possibly they're there to symbolize it, but they certainly are not mountains. Now, when you go to Petra, you will find the two mountains of Safa and Marwa. They're named that. These mountains of Safa and Marwa have been discovered. There are ruined foundations on each with the remnants of what could be earlier Nabatean temples. Today, one can also see later ruins of an old church there that you can see on the right side of the picture. What about the Zamzam well? Well, according to Al-Bukhari, it refers to streams in Mecca in volume 2, hadith number 685. Yet there are no streams in Mecca at all. The most that you'll get is the Zamzam well, which is in Mecca, but it is not a stream. It is only one well and could not have accommodated all the caravans that Muslims tell us they're approached Mecca. There was no water at all. There still is hardly any water. It all has to be piped in from other sources. When you go to Petra, however, there are well and water systems. There's all kinds of water systems. They're still there today. And there are many wells. Possibly that's the Zamzam well they're referring to that you see in the upper right-hand picture. What about Muzdalifah? Muzdalifah is according to what is in Mecca today. Muslims stand and pray there until sunset, and on Mount Arafat or Mount Mercy, and then they spend the night in the plain of Muzdalifah. Now, Petra has a mountain. If you look at the one in Mecca, it's miles away from the Kaaba, but the one in Petra, it's right there. It's a huge mountain, has a slippery slope, and it has a mosque and the ancient church on the top, and at least 5,000 people can easily stand and pray on it, which fits what the traditions say, exactly what they used it for. And then you get to the Jamarats. The Jamarat are these pillars, 3 of them that are in Mecca, where people throw anywhere from 49 to 72 stones at these 3 devils. Today, it has now become 3 pillars, which were exposed in the upper left, but to now, most recently, they have now enclosed those 3 pillars. You can see the upper right picture. But here's the question, why 3 Jamarats? Are there 3 devils? I always thought there was only 1 devil. So what in the world are 3 devils doing in Mecca? When you go to Petra, you will find the Jamarat there. There's a picture in the bottom right. And it is only 1 pillar because there's only 1 devil. So it looks like the Jamarat has its antecedents in Petra, not in Mecca. So the need for a place was already in place. Petra has all the stations of the pilgrimage which are now found in Mecca. A square, the Kaaba, with the exact dimensions mentioned by Al-Zaraqi, which does not fit the present-day Kaaba in Mecca, but does there in Petra. The Safa and Marwa mountains, to commemorate Hagar looking for water, are in Petra with places for idols at the top, and not little rocks as we find in Mecca, but actually full mountains. The washing of water with cisterns and waterways are in Petra, not in Mecca, which only has 1 well, the Zamzam well. And the plain of Muzdalifah, a slippery slope mountain with a mosque and church on it at the top, and where at least 5,000 people could pray, is only found in Petra. The Jamarat platform with the pillar to throw 49 to 72 rocks is also found in Petra, not the 3 platforms in Mecca, suggesting 3 different devils. Dan's conclusions on Petra. According to his latest findings, he says the traditions tell us that Mecca is in a valley, yet Mecca isn't while Petra is. The Thanael cliffs are not in Mecca, but they can be found extensively in Petra. The Quranic god Allah and the goddess Allat and Al-Uzza are uniquely from Petra, not Mecca. And then you have all the stations on the pilgrimage referred to in the earliest texts are found in Petra. In fact, everything the Quran, the traditions speak of can be found in Petra and are more realistic and much more historical. So can you see then why this newest material that Dan's coming up with is now confronting any notion that this city of Mecca could have been the place that either Muhammad came from or the Islam began at, or the Quran could have been written in. Now, here are criticisms, and here's what we need to do. We need to say that there are people who are criticizing Dan, and possibly the most important is Dr. David King. And here is his study that he did called The Petra Fallacy. It came out in 2018, 2 years ago. It's a good, let's see, 54 pages long. If you have a chance, do read it. I've gone through it, and Al-Fadi and I did a whole set of programs on it, confronting it and coming to conclusions on it. And that's what I'm going to introduce to you today, because we need to look and see what the criticisms are of Dan, because we need to see both sides of the equation. We need to understand why is it that people are criticizing Dan, but we also need to make sure that we come up with reference, and we also come up with support and responses to these criticisms. Let's go ahead and let's start, and let's introduce these 2 individuals. On the left, you see Dr. David King. He has been a lecturer in Edinburgh and also in Germany. He is considered to be the world authority on the Qibla, and that's why it's important that we listen to him. Since he has done the most work on the Qibla than anybody else until Dan, he is a worthy critique of Dan, and that's why when he wrote his paper in 2018, he was quite incensed with Gibson, and you'll see that. And if you read it, you'll see it just in the first page. The tone of it is very angry. He's very upset with what Gibson has found, and you can see why as we go through it. But let's look at this debate. Let's look at see what King is coming up with, and let's start with his defining terms. He defines 4 different eras. He calls pre-Islam anything up until 549. And then he calls early Islam from 550 to 799. So that would be just before Muhammad was born in 570, up until the 799, the end of the 8th century. And then he moves into what he calls medieval Islam, and that's from the 800s to the 9th century up until the 1300s. That's the 14th century. And then he refers to modern Islam as 1300 up until today. Those are his defining terms. So let's use those terms, and let's go with what he says. I'm not sure I agree with them, but nonetheless, since he categorizes them, we'll use his categories for our talk today. Now, let's start with their presuppositions. Both King and Gibson agreed that the Qiblas in the earliest 200 years after Muhammad go in all kinds of directions. There's nobody can dispute that, and so they both start from that agreement. King, however, assumes that the 9th through 12th century Muslim scholars, the medieval scholars, who were mathematicians, that their mathematical viewpoints and theories are the correct ones, suggesting that the earlier myriad of Qibla's directions were due to not knowing mathematics, that they were just ignorant. The earlier Arabs were just simply ignorant, and so they use other varied reasons for their directions, and that's why we find a multiplicity of different directions of the Qibla. Gibson assumes that these medieval scholars from the 9th and 12th century are much too late. And so instead, he goes back to the 7th and 8th century, to the time that these mosques were being built, to the time that the Qiblas were being formed, and measures the Qibla on the ground. So he goes to each one of these mosques personally and measures them, and then comes up with other theories to explain them. And of course, you know what they are, that the Qiblas follow not a multiplicity of directions, a variety of directions, but really only 4 directions. And they are all understood once you look and see what's happening politically on the ground. If you follow the politics, you can follow why the 4 Qiblas were created and maintained. Now, these four directions you can see here, I've done this already. You have about 17 of them that are up till 706 only facing Petra. There was a confusion for the next 100 years. Then the 20 that face are in between, followed by the 10 that face Mecca and the 6 that are parallel. Yet the Qibla was then not finalized towards Mecca until 876, which is 250 years, much too late. Here's that first one. This is a kind of review what we just did before the break, but I wanted just to make some notes on that. There are no Qiblas which are directed in any other direction than Petra up to 706, and these earliest mosques were probably previously Nabatean temples. This comes up a lot of times. People ask me, how can you have Qiblas that exist while Muhammad was still living, such as 624 and 632? Well, these are Nabatean temples. That's why. These were the Nabateans who their temples were always facing their ancestral, what's the word? I can't think of the name now. They're facing their tombs and temples, and they were facing, therefore, the sanctuary. That's the word I'm looking for. So they were facing the sanctuary of their people, of their ancestors. That's why they were all facing Petra. They then became mosque as Islam then took them over and then renamed them. Well, mosque could be in any language, in any culture. A mosque is a place where you bow. It's a masjid al-haram. It is a place of bowing, the forbidden place of bowing. And that's why those original floor plans, that's why it's so important you go to the ruins, and that's why it's so important that you then measure those qiblas. Since the Nabateans were traders, who were famous for being able to cross the trackless deserts on camels, they never had their own empire. So Petra took on an even added importance as their sanctuary, littered with tombs and temples. Here, I'm looking for the word, and it's right there on the page. The second Qibla between, let's ask some notes on that. The first of these between mosques was built after the Second Civil War in 706, and it was known as the Wasit Mosque, which if you know anything about Arabic, Wasit means between. So it was named for what it was doing. It was named because it was between these two cities. That should be quite evident. It was built in Iraq by al-Hajjaj, who is the governor over there in Kufa, the governor of Iraq under Abd al-Malik, after killing Ibn Zubair in Hijaz. That's the reason he turned away from Mecca. 20 more mosques were built using this between direction of Qibla, all under the authority of al-Hajjaj. And they were continued to be built until Hajjaj died. Once he died, there was no reason now to build these mosques in that direction, and they were then redirected back to Mecca. Al-Kinani al-Basri in 776 to 868 mentioned that the between Qiblas tarnished the reputation of the Caliph al-Walid, the son of Abd al-Malik, who allowed them. So you can see that this is well known. This is in their traditions. They called them the between the mosques. So this is not something that Gibson has made up off the top of his head. He's actually referring to not only what the traditions say, but also the historical context of that day. Now, the Meccan mosque only began to appear in 727. That's over 100 years too late. Muhammad ibn Abd al-Azraqi in 837, author of the Kitab Akhbar al-Makkah that I referred to earlier, which reports about Mecca. The earliest of 17 manuscripts are from the 12th century, gives dimensions for the walls of the Kaaba, which fit Petra perfectly, but not Mecca. Archaeologists in Mecca still today have not found a thing of note except an old Ottoman fort, suggesting that there simply is no history to Mecca. And listen, if this is the oldest city's history in the history of mankind, if this is where Adam and Eve were sent to, if this is where Abraham lived in 1900 BC, when they started building all of those huge towers, the fourth highest building in the world is built right there at the Kaaba with that huge clock around it, 45 feet across. That clock tower, you have to, when you build it that high, you have to have huge foundations. And when you dig foundations, you go with the builders, the archaeologists come licking their lips because they know there are going to be all kinds of artifacts that are going to be dug up from the foundations. They haven't found a thing. Not one thing. Suggesting to me and to everybody else that there is no history there at Mecca. Surprise, surprise. We're not surprised at all. Now, the fourth Qibla, the parallel Qibla, when we look at the notes and around that, we notice that King says that these are nothing more than solstitial lines. Gibson does not answer this, but considers they are for political reasons. He notes that these different Qiblas bothered the medieval scholars, and they therefore suggested many theories. And they talked about the fact that they were following stars or the sun or the equinox or building walls or solstice lines. Whereas facing the walls of the Kaaba or the quadrants of the Kaaba, etc., etc. They try to find out every type of excuse as to why these Qiblas were facing many different directions. Now, it is these varied ideas that Dr. King accepts. He just accepts wholesale than medieval scholars who are writing in the 9th and 10th century. Very few people today accept these theories because they just are that, nothing more than theories. There's nothing that they are looking at that they can support it other than that. I think this is what they're doing. I think it's going this way. I think it's going that way. Therefore, they are suspect. And that's why Gibson's 4 Qiblas match the historical account so much better and therefore are more readily acceptable. Now, let's go into their methodologies. How did they come to their conclusions? King only studied around 5 to 6 mosques. This is the world authority on the Qibla, and he only studied 5 to 6 mosques. He only physically went to 1 mosque. He only went to 1 of them. His whole career based on the Qibla, and he only went to 1 mosque, the Samarkand Mosque, which is in Tashkent in Uzbekistan. Most of what he knew, therefore, he got from books. He got from other people's writings, specifically the 9th, 10th, and 11th century medieval scholars. Gibson, on the other hand, went to every mosque physically, went to all of them personally, and measured their Qiblas using modern techniques. He used the Advanced Thermal Emission and Reflection Radiometer, the Aster satellites, which are the most exacting, sophisticated satellites that's used for measurements today. King, rather than quoting 7th to 8th century writers, which he should have done because they were writing at the time these mosques were being built, simply quoted later 9th to 11th century medieval Islamic scholars concerning their theories regarding why the earlier Qiblas were so ulta-pulta, as we say in Hindi. He loved to use al-Bazdawi, who lived from 1030 to 1100 up to the 12th century, because he wrote a paper on him in 1983. Yet look at the dates, much too late, and all of his ideas are nothing more than theories or guesses. He only trusted them because they were closer to the time than we are. Can you see the problem there? No, they aren't. They may be closer than we are, but they're not closer to the material that Dan Gibson went to. King's assumption assumed that the variety of Qibla directions were due to the inability of the ancient Arabs to find accurate Qibla directions because they didn't know mathematics and thus were simplistic and inaccurate. He forgot just how adept the ancient Nabateans were in crossing the great trackless deserts using the stars to guide them. He also assumed that the later Meccan Qiblas were much more accurate and thus believed that they knew better than the earlier Muslims how to direct Qiblas. But this is not necessarily true. Note, we already looked at this. The most inaccurate Qiblas were actually the Meccan Qiblas. The most accurate were the between Qiblas, followed by the Petrid Qiblas, followed by the parallel Qiblas, and then followed by the Meccan Qiblas. So that theory you can throw out the window. The mathematics did not help them. Now, why is it that the earlier ones were so much better? There's a good reason why they were so much more accurate. King thought that the other medieval and modern Muslim scholars had assumed that their earlier Arabs didn't have adequate mathematical skills. That's why they did not know where the accuracy of their Qiblas. Yet what really happened was the Arabs lost their ability to find directions accurately because Roman roads were introduced, which they used, and thus did not need to use stars to guide them anymore. Instead, they employed mathematical equations, which turned out to be less accurate. Thus, the ability to detect very accurate measurements was lost. Gibson goes back to the earliest Arabs who built the earliest mosques and found out that they used astronomy, not the study of stars. Astronomy, which is the study of stars, to find one's direction, not astrology, which is not the study of stars, but that is to find the future. And they had to because of their trips across so much desert, where the sands shifted and moved. There were no roads there. There weren't even mountains there. You had sand dunes. And with every storm, those dunes shifted and changed. Therefore, if they did not know where they were going, they would die because they would not know where the next oasis was, where their next well was. It was out of sheer survival that they used the stars. How did they do it? Well, to go north and south, he found out that they used something as simple as the North Star. And what they would do is take a kamal, it was a block of wood, like you see on the right there, with a string going through it with knots on it. And they would use it and put it up to the star, and they would pull the string away until the North Star was at the top of the block and the horizon was at the bottom of the block. Once they were there at that point, they looked and saw how many knots there were, and they knew exactly every one of those knots was how many steps, how many thousands or tens of thousands of steps in that particular direction. And that's how they could go north and south quite easily. In order to get their destination correctly, they needed to use a constant. That's why they used the Kabbal. And then they would use a number of steps a man would walk to arrive at the place they were going. They traveled on foot those days with camels, which were used for carrying goods. Yet, because of the fact there were tens of thousands of steps, they could easily get 1 step or 2 steps or even 10 steps. They could forget numbers. That's the problem with counting thousands of steps. So they employed poetry, which had a rhythm and allotted a number of steps for each poem. Even today, the Arabs are still doing that. You look and you see them, they're still reciting poetry. That's why they were so good at memorization, because they had to memorize these long pieces of poetry. When they came to the end of their poem, they would know how far they had reached and simply added up the number of times they recited a certain poem. That's the reason they chanted poetry as they walked, and they still do that today. If they wanted to go east and west, they had 32 stars which were used on a compass to know when they needed to go east or west from their location in relation to the North Star. Thus, for instance, they would walk towards, let's put this one up here, Al-Naka. That's so many tens of thousands of steps. This is a star in a northwestern direction, which they went for a certain number of strides. In this case, this particular poem that they recited, let's say 16 times. Once they got to Naka, they then turned towards this star, Altir, which is in the eastern direction. And they knew what poetry to go to Altir, and they would have that poetry that they would then recite as they walked until they got to that position. And that's how they found north, south, east, and west. What's fascinating, King has not ever even mentioned that in any of his writings. He didn't even know about that because he didn't go back to the 7th and 6th and the 5th century to find out how the Arabs, the only ones to get across these deserts, remember, they were the only ones that were trading from the Mediterranean world all the way over into China, all the way over into India. They were the only ones able to cross the deserts because they used the stars, proving that they knew their directions more accurately than the later Arabs who used only mathematics. Now, here's King's theories. He had 7 theories that he saw wrong with Dan Gibson. Built on the authority of the prophet or his companions, he said was the first reason that they got QIBLAs wrong. He didn't explain this one very well, but he said he did, nor did he source where he got his idea from, though it was probably his friends, the 9th and 11th century medieval scholars. And that's the reason they said, well, they just didn't know. They just used the prophet for their authority and his companions, and therefore they didn't know really how to find these QIBLA. Gibbon answers that and says, we don't know of any writings prior to the 9th century which refer to this theory. Shouldn't we therefore just use that which we already know from the 7th and 8th century? Theory number 2, as to why they got these QIBLAs wrong, well, they were built on foundations of or in line with pre-Islamic religious architecture, which were cardinally aligned. King therefore concluded Roman buildings or Byzantine buildings. Gibson said no, they only built over top of these buildings because they could then use the rubble of these buildings and stones from these buildings, and because they were centrally located. They were always built in the big center of the city. That's why they built over top, but they did not use those lines or those architectural, the architectural walls on them for what, as you can see, why a little later. They usually built in completely new directions, almost always towards Petra up until 706, and then to other directions, depending on the political exigency of that time. Theory number 3, according to King, they built according to the street plans of pre-Islamic cities. And the example that he gives is this Mosque of Cordoba, which follows the street plans. Gibson notes that the Umayyad Mosque in Jerash, on the right, that you can see pictured there, it sits askew of the city plans. So it didn't work for Jerash. Maybe it did for Cordoba, but it did for Jerash. And then he said, look at the other 100 mosques, over 100 mosques. That none of those mosques were following street plans, only the one in Cordoba. And he said possibly a few more. But of that, almost all the mosques are following what another plan, nothing to do with street plans. So the 4th theory that King came up with was that they were built towards the winter sunrise or sunset, or towards some other astronomical horizon phenomenon, and he calls the word sacred geography. And this is his quote. The Muslims developed a sacred geography in which over the centuries various schemes were developed in which segments of the perimeter of the Kaaba corresponded to sectors of the world which had the same Qibla, defined in terms of astronomical risings and settings. The first such schemes appeared in Baghdad in the 9th century. Gibson has problems with this. He came to the conclusion on the astronomical alignments by looking at only 3 cities, the cities of Cordoba, Cairo, and Samarkand, whose alignments were similar to that of the Kaaba. That's it? A theory built on just 3 cities? These theories were only created after the 9th century, so much too late to explain what they were doing in the 7th and 8th century. So he's looking at the wrong century to even get this theory from. That doesn't help us with the 7th to 8th century when this supposedly sacred geography didn't even exist. There are no known records or writings about the sacred geography in the 7th and 8th century when these more accurate qiblas were being erected. Thus, isn't this simply a later redaction and nothing more than a theory? The fact that the earlier qiblas were more accurate suggests that the later medieval scholars either lost that knowledge or refused to repeat it. Theory number 5. They had different qiblas because they were more or less due south or in Jordan and Syria. The mosque in Jordan and Syria all face due south, which is close to Mecca. Gibson says, of course, the mosque in Jordan and Syria face south, because both Petra and Mecca are south of these two countries. Yet when you look at the qiblas and test Mecca against Petra, all of them are closer to Petra than Mecca. Furthermore, all the other mosques, which are not north or of these two cities, such as east and west, also face Petra and not Mecca. Theory number 6. They built due west in India and due east in North Africa. Gibson says either King hasn't looked carefully at Gibson's research or he purposely chooses to disregard it. The mosque in India, especially the one in Cheraman, the Juma Mosque in Kerala in 629, are facing directly towards Petra, not Mecca. All the mosques in North Africa are facing due south, paralleling a line between Petra and Mecca, and not east. So either King is just not aware of this, or he refuses to read Gibson's book. But obviously, he cannot support that because none of these are facing west or east, according to his theory. Theory 7, built more or less due north in Yemen and East Africa. Gibson once again says either King hasn't looked at Gibson's research or he purposely chooses to disregard it. Naturally, the mosque in Yemen and East Africa are facing north because both Petra and Mecca are north of these countries. The Grand Mosque in Sana'a, built in 705, is only 0.36 from Mecca, but 8.8 degrees from Mecca. So it is very much facing Petra and not Mecca. So that debunks King's theory right there. What's more, there are absolutely no early East African mosques discovered yet. So why is he even saying that? He has nothing to refute to support it. Then King comes up with 6 mosques, and he tries to explain by using these 6 mosques that Gibson is completely wrong. He starts with the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. He says that it faces Petra, but it was built on a Byzantine basilica, which replaced a Roman temple. And that's why the Syrians happily built a mosque facing the Syrian corner of the Kaaba. Gibson knows about the history of this mosque, but the Byzantines did not follow the designs of the Roman temple below it. They only used the rocks and debris from the Roman temple, nothing more. So either King did not know this history or he refuses to admit it. The Muslims, like the Byzantines, built this mosque at the same place as the Byzantine church because it was in the center of town, but they completely tore it down and built over top of it using the debris. And the mosque does not face Petra, but the between position, so it's not even the same direction as the Byzantine basilica. And it is the same with the other 20 parallel mosques. So again, debunks that theory pretty quick. The Dome of the Rock. This is probably the most famous one, as we've been talking about before. And King says that it's facing south, so that could be Mecca. The problem, it's 12 degrees off from Mecca, and it's only 3.4 degrees from Petra. So it's obviously, it is much closer to Petra. It's even more close than the between mosques. So the Dome of the Rock and the Dome of the Chain and the Dome and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the whole citadel are facing Petra. So certainly not Mecca. He then goes to the Canton Mosque, the Guangzhou Mosque, and he disputes that. He says he believes it was directed towards the summer solstice, which is 295 degrees, and it couldn't have been built in 627, which is before Muhammad had died. Gibbon, again, says, listen, this was not a mosque, it was a temple, it was a Nabatean temple to begin with. Tradition says it was built by an uncle of Muhammad in 630. It was rebuilt in 1350 and 1695. On page 134 of his book, he shows that there was much contact with the Arabs and the Chinese at this time, from 100 BC to 600 AD. So there is no reason to doubt previous contact with the Nabateans. John Hill, he points to John Hill, who writes about the Chinese silk routes and mentions that the Chinese explorers visited the Middle East between 25 and 50 AD. He found that the Chinese had contact with the Nabateans specifically and took a group of them to China, where they could easily have explained their use of the stars that early. We are now only hearing about these contacts between the very early Arabs and the Chinese in just the last 4 or 5 years. Over 100 records of exchanges between the Chinese and the Romans are recorded as well. So it would have been easy for them to have incorporated the Nabatean technology for finding and directing using the stars. Again, debunking completely what King had said earlier. King then goes to the Sana'a Mosque there in Yemen, suggests that the major axis of the mosque is parallel to that of the Kaaba in Mecca. They wanted it to face the southeastern wall of the Kaaba, not Petra, which they knew nothing about. Gibson says that everyone had contact with Petra. Why is he saying that this was not known? Take a look at the maps that we showed earlier. It's a center of all the trade routes, so they all knew about Petra. What's more, it has a history going right back to the 2nd century BC. Where is there any literature, in other words, before medieval theories, which speak of using any walls of the Kaaba for directing early Qiblas? It just doesn't exist. This is nothing more than a theory that was created in the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. If they knew the direction of the Meccan Kaaba walls and were able to parallel the mosque so that direction was accurate, then why couldn't they have also directed their Qibla with equal accuracy directly towards Mecca? So you can't say that that's the reason they directed it, because then they would know exactly where that mosque was, and they could have therefore put their Qibla in that direction. The fact is, they didn't direct their Qiblas to Mecca until after 727. It was not even a factor because there was no Mecca that early. He talks about the Cordoba Mosque in Andalusia, and he says that it's facing south and not towards Mecca, and this is his quote. He believes it was built to follow the Roman pattern, with the minor axis solsticely aligned between the summer sunrise and the winter sunset. And it was built exactly in accordance with that suburban street plan. And that is why it faces a direction perpendicular to the solstice. Its major axis is parallel to the major axis of the Kaaba. And King uses Michael Bonin, who has found that these mosques in North Africa follow Roman plans of a city, which follow the cardinal directions. Gibson's response to that. The map at the right, just take a look at it and look at the red lines. They do not follow these directions. Note the differences between the older southern section and the newer northern section. They follow two completely different directions. If this Cordoba Mosque follows Roman roads, then why do the other 8 North African mosques follow southern directions without equivalent Roman roads? This theory maybe only possible for Cordoba, but not the other 8. He believes the North Africans decided to follow neither the Umayyad nor the Abbasid sanctuaries, but used a direction which gave credit to both, and only when the Abbasids finally took over, all the subsequent North African mosques aligned their Qiblas towards uniquely Mecca. Number 6, the last one, Wasit Mosque. King believes that it was built and then that was faced the winter sunset, which is parallel with the Meccan Kaaba northeast wall, chosen by early Iraqis and then redirected later using mathematical equations. And he says that this was mostly acceptable in those days, but doesn't quote anyone, he just says it. Gibson's response is, isn't it odd that they could build a Qibla which was more or less parallel to the northeast wall of the Kaaba, but they could not find the Qibla, which actually was directed right at the Kaaba. And it was called the Between Mosque by Al-Hajjaj for a reason. Wasit means between, and this was his first mosque. Now we go into how his anger against anybody that disagrees. When you read this paper here, it is full of anger, full of vitriol. It is not very academic. It does not seem to have been written by a scholar. He says this, I never thought while preparing all my research that someday someone would come along and announce that all earlier mosques are oriented towards a location other than Mecca. No serious scholar, Muslim or non-Muslim, would ever have thought that mosques might have been deliberately oriented towards somewhere other than Mecca. If they had, they would rightly be considered deranged. This shows the danger of assuming Islam has its own history correct. Interestingly, only he, as a scholar, refused to consider any other possibility. Shouldn't a good scholar, always be open to peer review or other ideas or even reflections on his own views? How does he conclude that another view is deranged? Does it, using such vitriolic language, undermine his own argument? Employing ad hominem like that usually means one has no further ideas. He then goes on to say, especially against the revisionists. Some 50 years ago, some over-enthusiastic, I'm bolding that for a reason, London-based Arabists like John Wansborough and his student Michael Cook and Patricia Crone came up with the idea that Islam began not in Arabia, but somewhere unspecified in northwest Arabia. This was a curious idea, he says, not least because there was no obvious potential sites. One of the principal and most convincing arguments for their bold assertion was the fact that the earliest mosques in Egypt and Iraq do not face Mecca, but rather some locality in northwest Arabia. Note the words he uses in bold. He then goes on and says, Gibson has no qualification. Well, let's just go back that before I go on. What's fascinating, notice he calls these people over enthusiastic, a curious idea, bold assertions, and that they're calling a fact. Now, does he know who he's talking about? Take a look at those names. Look at those people. Dr. John Walmsbury, head of the Middle Eastern section of School of Oriental and African Study in the University of London, considered to be one of the greatest minds of his time in the 1970s and 1980s. Two of his students, Dr. Michael Cook, who now teaches as head of department at Princeton University in this very area. Dr. Patricia Corona reads and writes 15 languages, has done the most germinal work and is the most dangerous in this area because of her ability to read the original documents. And he says that these are just over-enthusiastic London-based Arabists, and that their ideas are curious, or that they are using bold assertions to make views that are facts. Can you see? I would suggest that he be careful who he's talking about. King then goes and says, well, what about Gibson? He has no qualifications. What about Gibson's 25 years on the field, or his over 100 mosques he has personally studied, or the languages he knows? It's interesting to me that King, who only went to one mosque, suddenly he has all the qualifications because he did all his work in a library. Gibson left the library and actually went to every one of these mosques in person. Isn't that what any good researcher should do? And that's why I say, be careful, King. You're going to find that it's your qualifications, though you have a doctorate and he doesn't. Where did you get your doctorate, and why have you spent your whole career researching these qiblas and not going to one of them to actually look and see where they were facing, or why they were facing in those directions? King goes on and says he has no understanding of the fact that modern directions from one place to another cannot be used to investigate the reasons underlying the orientation of pre-modern architecture. Gibson only used modern directions to measure the pre-modern architecture. As simple as that. You always use what's the best material at hand to be able to support your own findings. King then says Gibson seems oblivious to the fact that there is a well-established discipline called archaeoastronomy and has no understanding of astronomical alignments. Gibson does understand them perfectly. He just doesn't think that they're pertinent for the 7th and 8th century. They are nothing more than theories from the 9th, 10th, and 11th century. Gibson doesn't know anything about mosque construction. What about the many books on mosque construction he has read, including all of Creswell's books on the subject? Isn't Gibson the first to list all the earliest mosques? King goes on and says Gibson has no control over any of the numerous medieval Arabic sources, legal or astronomical, focused astronomical and mathematical, geographical, relating to the determination of the Qibla. Gibson has over 10,000 books in his library, all of them on these similar subjects. But King wouldn't know that because he didn't ask Gibson that to begin with. Gibson, he says, does not quote earlier medieval experts on the subject, so is not aware of their findings. Gibson knows them well, and he does quote them, but he doesn't use them because he doesn't agree with them because they're all much too late, and they start from the wrong presupposition. They're assuming that you can only use mathematics to find these qiblas without realizing that the earlier Muslims used the stars. Gibson shouldn't have chosen Petra for his location of the early Kaaba because in Petra, in the early 7th century, there were no Arabs, no Muslims, no Jews, and in brief, there was not much going on. It's obvious that King does not know his history well. Gibson didn't choose Petra, it chose him. All the Nabatean kings were called Arabs. That whole area was called Arabia in the north. Petra was, he's thinking that a modern Arabia, which has only been around for about 400 years. Petra was at the center of the trading world from the 2nd century right up until the 8th century, or possibly King just didn't know that. But then he did not go and look at pre-Islamic Arabia, which was centered at Petra. Gibson's work all has contributed to dubious causes. What exactly is dubious about what Gibson is doing? Shouldn't every scholar want to be peer-reviewed, and shouldn't every scholar want to go with what the nearest and the best research and evidence is at hand? But more seriously, King goes on and says, Gibson's writings are guaranteed to contribute to Islamophobia against those who have no idea about the one and only civilization, which really took orientations seriously for about 1400 years. I would suggest that this is nothing more than xenophobia by King. Is researching Islam academically or critically a sign of Islamophobia? And is he not following into the same track that Muslims always throw against us? This is part of the scientific process. And this is why we need peer reviews. Hundreds of Muslims are writing Gibson now, thanking him for helping them. How can this be Islamophobic if Muslims are thanking him for it? King goes on and says that Gibson's work has contributed to dubious causes. What exactly? Oh, I'm sorry, I've already done this one, so I'm just repeating myself. So he doesn't just confront the Orientalists and Gibson. He has a final warning in his 52-page article, and he says this: in all such investigations, no conclusion should be drawn based on actual Qibla direction calculated from modern geographical data using some kind of exact mathematical procedures. Also, measurements and calculations to the nearest degree are adequate for investigative purposes. Or any attempt at greater accuracy is unrealistic. Here's my question. Why not use modern data and exact mathematical procedures? Don't they show us just how accurate the Petrin and between mosque qiblas really are? Why does he refuse modern mathematics when it is the 9th to 11th century mathematics which he employed for his earliest calculations, which were wrong? Why in the world, if he did that, and he was the whole reason why he used the 9th to 11th century scholars, is because they had more accurate mathematical equations, why is then he disputing it here? When we have even more and much better geographical data, especially accurate GPS location and the Astra satellites. The very thing that he supports his theories with is what Gibson has done, but he's used modern 21st century accuracy over 9th to 11th century inaccuracy. And then I would ask, why settle for nearest degree when you can get exact degrees instead? What is he fearful of? Well, I can tell you what he's fearful of. He's fearful of his own career. King only researched 3 to 5 mosques, while Gibson has researched over 100. King only used 1 to 2 examples for each of his theories, while Gibson looked at what the evidence showed and employed over 100 examples. King asked us not to use any exact data or modern methods to come to any conclusions, while Gibson employed more accurate data, proving King wrong. King basically wants us to throw out any data which may confront his conclusions. Yet King only quotes 9th to 11th century theories without employing any earlier 7th to 8th century writers or the evidence which Gibson found. Muslims are not accepting King's views, since he suggests the earliest Muslims used Roman and Byzantine ruins for their qiblas, which is anathema to Muslims. All Muslims are to face the Masjid al-Haram, not the Kaaba. But there was a Masjid al-Haram already in Petra, and then a subsequent Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. King's ego has been hurt, and his career may possibly be in tatters because of what Gibson has found, which may explain his over-the-top opprobrium towards those who disagree with him. Now, we need to end, so let me do my concluding remarks. What we have seen in the last, well, goodness, it has been 2 hours. Sorry, I've gone over time. The late 9th to 10th century traditions are no longer viable. They just are too late and too far away. There are 3 problems with the historicity of Mecca. Well, number 1, its geography is incorrect, the wrong place at the wrong time. Number 2, references to it are all either non-existent or incorrect. Look at the vegetation and especially the olive trees. If Mecca is wrong, that means the Qibla is equally wrong. Dan Gibson's explanation for the 4 Qibla directions are viable and convincing. Petra fits the geographical and the vegetation references well. Petra versus Mecca fits the political machinations in the late 7th to early 8th century. Petra could be a precursor to Mecca or even a previous Mecca itself. Petra also fits the historical written references as well as the stages of the Hajj. Dr. David King's criticism of Gibson are not supported by any viable evidence. And his 7 criteria and his 6 mosque examples for early qiblas are not historically sound. I would say they're not even theoretically sound. If Gibson is correct, then Mecca is the wrong place at the wrong time, while Petra is the right place at the right time with the right historical support. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we'll put it up to questions now. So let me go ahead and see if you have questions, and I see that few of you do, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. So here is the first question. Doesn't Ibn Hisham actually say that he disapproved of what Ibn Ishaq wrote about Muhammad and changed? Exactly. Thanks, Stephen. That's true. And that's one reason why he then threw out 98% of it. He only retained what he thought was authoritative. He was not a student of Ibn Ishaq. Remember, Ibn Ishaq died in 765. He dies in 833. So we're talking about 70 years later. But he certainly only retained what he thought was authoritative, which suggests to me that there was an agenda there. And you can see that agenda comes really into focus when we get to the later traditions, especially the Hadith. Wouldn't the problem of the reliability oral tradition also be pointed out to Moses, who wrote the Pentateuch by Muslims? Yes, absolutely. And that's why it's fascinating, because people always say to me, what are you going to do with Abraham and Moses? They were also dependent on oral tradition. And I say one of the great things about Abraham, especially, and about Moses, is that if we are only dependent on oral tradition, and we must be suspicious of it, let's go and see whether or not it jives with the archaeological evidence. And we've got now 4 genera of tablets. We got the Nuzi tablets, we got the Mari tablets, we got the QIBLA tablets, 3 genre tablets that all come from the time of Abraham. They're in the 19th, from 23 BC up until 1600 BC. Abraham will be living about 1900 BC. They all are coming from the same area that Abraham grew up in, and they come from the same era that Abraham grew up in. Take a look at these tablets, which are extra biblical. They have nothing to do with Abraham, yet we find that every one of the customs that are referred to by Moses, referring to Abraham, are correct. And many of those customs went out of date when the Nuzi and the Mari tablets no longer were used after 1600 BC. So how can Moses have got every one of those customs correct? He was writing in 1400 BC. He never was in Mesopotamia. He never was in the Euphrates Valley. He would never have come across these tablets. He would never have known of these customs. The fact that he got every one of these customs correct shows that we've got the right man at the right place doing the right thing at the right time. Let me give you one more example. Look at the 2 cities of Sodom and Gomorrah that are referred to in the Bible, yet no historian has ever heard of these 2 cities. Thucydides does not write about it. Herodotus never writes about these 2 cities. And so many historians have always assumed that therefore the Bible is fictitious on these 2 cities. That was until the QIBLA tablets were discovered at Tel Marduk there in Syria. And when they dug down through the different layers of the Tel Marduk, they came down to the 2300 BC period, where they found an entire city that had been abandoned. In that city was one building one building that had imploded on itself. It was one room. In that one room, they found 17,000 tablets. Amongst those 17,000 tablets, they found one tablet with the name of Sodom, Gomorrah, Adman, Zebulun, and Zoar. Sodom and Gomorrah are listed on that tablet in 2300 BC. That's 400 years before Abraham. But what's more exciting about it, look at the list, look at the sequence of those 5 cities. Look at Genesis chapter 14, verse 8, and you see the exact same 5 cities in the same order that you find on the QIBLA tablets. Yet Sodom and Gomorrah, when Moses was writing Genesis 14:8, didn't exist. It was destroyed in 1900 BC. And when you look at those sequence of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zebulun, and Zoar, we know Admah, Zebulun, and Zoar. You look on a map, and they follow a trade route. This is a list of a trade route that started with Sodom, went to Gomorrah, then went to Admah, Zebulun, and Zoar, proving that not only that these cities existed at the time of Abraham, they were the trade route that was destroyed because these cities were destroyed. How did Moses know about those cities? How did Moses get the right names? And how did Moses get the right sequence? Ooh, I love it. So if he was only dependent on more oral tradition, then I would suggest that that oral tradition has a superintendent of the Holy Spirit. And that's why I love my Bible, because we don't ask Moses to be correct. We don't ask Abraham to be correct. And yet Moses gets the customs right, and he even gets the names and the locations of the city in the right order at the right time for the right period. God bless the Bible. I think so great of the Bible, because that's why I love to argue this, because when you look at the same demands of oral tradition with the Islamic traditions over here in the 9th and 10th century, they got everything wrong. They got the wrong city, they got the wrong place, they got the wrong people, they got the wrong bound, and they got the wrong book. On all 5 counts, the Islamic traditions are incorrect. In every count, we have found that the Bible has been correct. In fact, today, and I forget the man who actually quotes this, he says, if you look at every artifact, if you look at every amulet, if you look at every of these, what they call these stellas, and these amulets, I'm thinking of well, let's just look at the artifacts that you have all over the British Museum. And when you look at all these artifacts, every tablet, every mural, every stela, every obelisk, take a look and see what they talk about when it comes to the Bible. In every case, they do not controvert a properly understood biblical statement. We have not found yet one contradiction for any of the archaic ancient pieces of literature that controverts one properly understood biblical statement. Therefore, the Bible is the only piece of oral tradition, if you want to call it, that has stood the test of time and has stood every one of these criticisms. You can talk about redacted criticism, you can talk about source criticism, you can talk about historical criticism, you can talk about literary criticism. The Bible has gone through every one of those criticisms. It has been doing so for the last 150 years and has withstood every criticism. Now we're taking the exact same material, we're taking the same criticism, and we're applying them to the Quran. What I did today was not only historical criticism, I was also looking at redacted criticism and source criticism. And can you see the Quran, the Bible, Islam, and certainly Muhammad fall to pieces when we apply these same criticisms. That's why it's a lovely area of exercise. We need to continue to do it. This is from Charles Nelson. He says, isn't it possible Muhammad had contact with the people of Ad-Thamud Midian because he was into trading? Absolutely, but daily contact? And why is it that he has daily contact? And and here's the other problem. Where do you find any reference for the people of Ad-Thamud or Midian in Mecca or Medina? There is no reference of any of these people that being that far south. So evidently, if he's having daily contact with them, he has to be where they are at, which means much further north. We're going to get into this much more in depth when we get to the Qira'at and when we get into the quest. Hold on to that question, Charles, because we're going to really underline that when we get to that material. Al Nash says this: how do the two Arabians referred to in the book of Chronicles in the Bible relate to the new revelations, histories of Islam? Is anyone investigating? Absolutely. Alan, this is the great thing. Take a look and see where Arabia is in the Bible. Arabia is in Jordan and Iraq. There is no reference to any Arabs down south of Medina Saleh. Medina Saleh is the lowest southern point in the biblical text. And look where Medina Saleh is on the map. It's way above what we know as Medina today. So Arabia was known, basically all the areas of what we now know as Syria and Jordan was known as Arabia. Today, the problem, the confusion that we're having is we're thinking that Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is nothing more than a modern name for a modern people that's not been around for more than 400 years. So Arabia in the biblical context is much further north, and it is exactly where we're finding this Muhammad exists, where this Islam begins. Wait till we get to the Quran. Wait till you get to the Arabic in the Quran. The Arabic in the Quran does not come from Middle Arabia, does not come from the Hijaz. It all comes from the north, but let's hold off for that until we get to that lecture. And let's go on down. Any other questions? Francois, you're from Canada, and you say the alleged origin of the Sunnah is from 9th and 10th century, Hisham, Bukhari, Al-Tabari. When do we have original manuscripts for them? Is it possible that in itself be a tradition referred back to the 9th and 10th century? Oh, I love this. Thank you, Francois. You moved right into a real huge hornet's nest. The question he's asking is this. We all talk about Al-Bukhari from 870. We all talk about Ibn Hisham from 833. Do we have any document of their manuscripts from 833 or 870? And the answer is absolutely no. Remember, Al-Bukhari wrote 9 volumes. 9 volumes. The first volume, the oldest volume, is from the 12th century, 1100s. He died in the 800s. The earliest volume we have for any of Al-Bukhari is 300 years after his death. The other 8, we don't really are introduced to them until the 1500s. We don't have anything earlier than that. So even, we haven't even got into this, whether or not we can trust Al-Bukhari. So even the traditions, as far as documentation, it's obvious to me that the Muslims were absolutely inept at retaining or restoring or holding on to their documents. And we're going to see this when we get to the Quranic manuscripts, and we're especially going to see this when we get to the Qira'at talk. But can you see, this is a real problem, Francois. I don't know how the Muslims are even supporting it. Everything we know about Al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, everything we know about Ibn Dawud, everything we know about Al-Tabari, everything we know about Ibn Hisham or Al-Waqidi is all attribution. It's all attributed to them. And their attributions are attributed to Muhammad. Isn't that interesting? Nothing more than attributions. So if you want to talk about documentation for any of this, you're talking about hundreds of years after the fact. Thank God we don't have this problem with our Bible. And thank God we don't have this problem with our Sirah and our Hadith and our Tafsir and our Tahqiq. Alan asked this question. What was the fight between the Abbasids and the Umayyads about again? Well, it's a fight for power. Remember, the Abbasids are the carryover from the Persians. They were the original Sassanids. They were defeated, destroyed by the Arabs, and that's why the Arabs who set up the Umayyad dynasty were at absolute at odds politically speaking. It was a political struggle. And the Abbasids wanted to come back and wanted to retain their power again. And so that political struggle existed from 651 when the Umayyads come into, 661 when the Umayyads come into power, all the way up until 749. 749 when the Abbasids finally take over that power and wrest control from Damascus and bring it back to Baghdad, which used to be Ctesiphon. Okay, so that's it was a political problem. Where's the next question? Doesn't the Cordoba Mosque face Damascus? What date do you put on the Quran? Patrick, I'd have to go look and see. I don't know whether it faces Damascus, but if they, the Cordoba Mosque does not face Damascus. I mean, I can see that. I see what you're talking about. The Cordoba Mosque faces directly south. Damascus is way over to the east. So look at it again. Go up on this book and you'll see. I don't have time right now to look it up what page it's at, but look at this book and see where the Cordoba Mosque, and you'll see it faces directly south, as do all the Spanish mosques and also the North African mosques. And then you go on and ask, what date do you put on the Quran in Istanbul? I would put right off the top of my head, I'm going to say you're talking about the Topkapi manuscript, which is in the Topkapi Museum there in Istanbul. Most scholars are putting that between 720 to 770. 720 to 770. So the latter half of the first after Hijrah, which would be 622 to 719, and then the first half of the second Hijrah, which would be 719 to 770. So somewhere between 719 and 770 is where the Istanbul document known as the Topkapi manuscript. May we have copies of your printed documents? Thank you. Yes, those of you who are coming through who have come onto my list, I will send you all my PowerPoint. You will all get it, but you have to be on my list. So Stephen, I will send you a copy and you can put it up all with your people. Okay, so both people you will get the PowerPoints of everything I'm doing. You'll get them so you can use them. Feel free to use them. And listen, I don't mind if Muslims see them as well. Do not censor them. Do not hide them away. Anybody can see them. In fact, if anything, Muslims need to see them because they need to be confronted by them. Here's another question by Craig. When did they change the directions of the mosques to face Mecca? Well, again, from what we've just seen here, the first one we see is 727. When they finally started doing it, all of them was not till 822. So from 822, all the mosques now are facing Mecca. Now, some, according to Dan, he said that there are some still holdouts that continue up until 876, which would be the late 9th century. But they begin to start facing Mecca from 727 on. That's 100 years after Muhammad died and 100 years after the QIBLA was canonized, according to the Quran in chapter 2, verse 145 to 149. Not a short period of time at all. It took a long period of time to do this. And that was because of political problems they had on the ground. How should we, this is Stephen, how should we prepare to minister to Muslims who will leave Islam as a result of this material? Listen, let me just tell you I got a text that came in this morning, and I shared it with Steve earlier. This was sent to me from someone in India who says, Jay Smith, one Ahmadi Muslim leader of state in India watched your video regarding Petra. This is not this one, another one that I done earlier. And now he fully is convinced by all the research presentation by you. And he has now left Ahmadiyya Islam and has accepted Jesus Christ. Please pray for him, for he is an Arabic scholar. He studied 10 years in the Qadian Madrasa. Thank you, Brother Jay, for the work you're doing. God bless you. That just came in this morning. We are starting to see this over and over again. We're starting to see many Muslims who are leaving Islam because of this material. And you can see why. They have been told their whole lives. This was a leader in the Ahmadiyya community. He has been told his whole life. He studied for 10 years at a Qadian mosque. So you can see he has always been told that Mecca was the center of Islam, that the Quran is a book that was revealed to one man, Muhammad, and has never changed. Not one word, not one letter has changed. All of that is coming to has now been debunked, and we're debunking it hugely this year, especially in 2020. We're having more success in 2020 than I think of any year that I've been working in Islam, and I've been working in Islam for about 40 years. Expect that Muslims are going to come through. We're getting it. I'm getting in emails. People are sending this. I just got this morning. We're getting these kind of responses. What do we do with them? I think we need to make sure that we bring them away from the Quran back to the Bible, because in everything we're doing, we're disillusioning and destroying the foundations of Islam. But please, please don't leave them destroyed. Please don't leave them destroyed. We've got to take them away from the Quran, but we immediately need to introduce the Bible. We've got to take them away from Allah. We need to immediately introduce Yahweh. We've got to take them away from Muhammad, and we need to immediately introduce the Jesus Christ. I remember when I left Speaker's Corner back in 2017, the last Sunday I was there, the last man that saw me and wanted to talk to me as I left was in tears. He says, please don't leave. We need this material. I said, what are you talking about? He says, I'm an atheist. And he says, I'm getting sick and tired of hearing Christians just tell me their testimony. I don't care about the testimony because what God has done for them is not what he's done for me. But you come and you start talking about names, dates, places, and events, and you come across with all this historical evidence. He says, that suddenly jives me. That makes me excited because you're speaking my language. I love what you're doing because you're answering the question we're asking. And the question we're asking is very simple. Is it true? Just 3 words. That's all we're asking. And you're answering that question. And I turned to him and I looked at him and I said, you know, I'm glad you're getting excited by this, but I hope you don't use it. I don't want you to use this material. I said, all you're interested in is destroying the Quran, destroying Muhammad, destroying Allah, and you have nothing to replace it with. You have nothing to offer them. This is really for us as Christians. This is our polemic. We need to use it because I do not want to destroy that faith they have. They have a faith in God. I want to keep it there. I just want to bring it home to our God. They have a faith in the prophetic line. I want to keep that there. I just want to bring them back to the right prophetic line. They have a faith in the prophet Muhammad. I just want to bring them home to Jesus Christ. They have a faith in revelation. You don't have a faith in any revelation. They have a faith in revelation. I want to bring that faith and bring it back to the real revelation, the Bible. I said, this is really our polemic because we are the only ones that can destroy their foundation and offer them a much better foundation, a much bigger book, a much bigger God, a much bigger prophet. We are the only ones that can do this. So, Steve, I would say we have to be in this debate more so than anybody else. We need to be at the forefront of this debate. We need to be using this material because we are the only ones that have the antidote. We are the only ones that have the alternative. Do not destroy their faith. Just bring it home. Just bring it home. Bring them home. I hope that answers your question. Let's bring them home. Okay, and I don't see any more questions. That's it. What a question to end off in. Thanks, Steve. That's a great way to end off. I now leave it over to you. God bless you. And listen, do use this material. I'm sure there are going to be more questions. We'll do the coins next week. The coins next week will not be this long. This is a long one because we had to review an awful lot of the old material, and then we had to get into the new material. Next week, we're going to go right into coins. This will be new for most of you. It's exciting. It's, again, getting back to the 7th century and seeing what exactly happening. Following the whole data that we see by looking at coins, coins do not disintegrate, they do not deteriorate, and they have a story to tell, and we need to read that story, and it's not the story that the Islamic traditions are telling. It's a completely different story. God bless you. We'll see you in 1 week. Back to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you so much, fellows, for joining in. I want to remind you, we now have capacity for 500 people to participate. Invite them. We're going to send you that link again. If you have colleagues who can benefit from this, please share the link. Contrary to our original instructions, because we were limited to 100, and we thought, oh well, no, we want to go for this. This is Jay. It may seem long to you, and I'm sure it does, but boy, it just flew by for me. This is excellent. Thank you so much, brother. And
I promise I won't make it this long again. This is the longest.
Okay, I know that. I'm a fanatic. I'm sorry. No, thank you so much, guys. We love you all. We hope to see you next Thursday, 9:30 a.m. Central Time, same time for you guys, wherever it was you are. And thank you, and God bless you all till we see you then. And we'll get
Thank you.
Thank you.